Robb Stark led his northern host across the white-laden plains with the grim resolve of a man who had seen too many betrayals to trust fortune's favors. The standards of the dire wolf, the mailed fist of Glover, the sunburst of Karstark, the merman of Manderley, and the roaring giant of Umber mingled in the whirling snow, all converging behind the king in the north as he guided them toward the Dreadfort. Gray wind padded at his stirrup, his muzzle streaked with melting frost, ears pricked forward as if sensing the shape of the battles yet to come. Though winter's chill was merciless, the men felt a fierce anticipation burning through the layers of fur and wool they wore. The siege of Winterfell had ended in blood and victory. Now they marched to finish the war. The column stretched long, trudging steadily through deep drifts, horses laboring, men stamping at ice that crusted in their beards. At the forefront rode Robb and his principal captains. Hother Umber, massive in the saddle with a battered hammer resting across his lap. Wylus Manderley, the newly proven commander who had led the flank during the Battle of Winterfell's walls. Gavin Glover, a brooding figure whose eyes blazed with the memory of the Red Wedding, and Jory Karstark, who wore no illusions about how high the stakes ran. They all knew that Lord Roose Bolton, broken but still dangerously cunning, had fled with a remnant of his men. If the rumors held, he had regrouped at the Dreadfort. There, behind high walls and grim traditions, House Bolton had once ruled with cold efficiency, and once allied with House Stark, though that alliance was now a hollow shell. The wind carried a bite that even the thickest cloaks could not deny. The North's ancient power loomed in every gust, as though the land remembered well the old feuds. At times, the sky turned so white with blowing snow that the men could see only a dozen yards ahead. Yet they pressed on, guided by scouts on snowshoes who would range out, planting markers at intervals. Voices were low, breath plumed in the numbing air, and the trample of boots became an odd, steady rhythm, one that reminded them all of a funeral march. Still, a strange hope underpinned each step. They advanced with more unity now than any time since Robb's ill-fated southern campaign. Here in the raw heart of winter, men found that unity born of common purpose, to rid their homeland of the traitor who had cost so many Stark lives. Food and fodder remained limited, but Wylus Manderley's caravan had brought enough provisions to sustain them for a time. Wagons rolled along behind the main body, heavily guarded. They held barrels of salted fish, onions, some dried fruits, and sacks of tough barley for the horses. Rabbits and other game made small supplements. By night, they halted in hollows or dells shielded by stands of pine. Crews trampled down the snow, cleared brush to lay tents or half-shelters, and posted watchmen in a ring around the camp. Fires burned low to conserve wood. The men ate, offered quiet prayers, then slept in battered bedrolls. Robb himself would share a small tent with a few of his closest men. Gray wind usually curled outside or at his feet. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the ghosts of the Red Wedding, the wail of arrow bolts, and the betrayal that had nearly snuffed out House Stark. Through the swirling gloom, they marched for several days, forging a path northeast. The land became ever more desolate, with fewer hamlets or farmsteads. Those they did find were husks of log structures blackened by old raids. Sometimes the locals had fled entirely. Other times a handful of survivors emerged, trembling, to stare at the banners that passed by. Robb would speak gently to them, advising them to find shelter in Winterfell, warning them that the Dreadfort region would soon see war. Some came along. Others chose to remain, having no strength to uproot from the only place they knew. On the 5th day of travel, the sky cleared for a few hours, allowing the sun to glint on the icy fields. The men used that moment to reorganize. Scouts rode in, reporting that one of their outrider parties had found recent tracks. Light cavalry with flayed man banners. It seemed Roose Bolton had men patrolling the outer approaches to the Dreadfort. That came as no surprise. The next day, those same outriders clashed with a Bolton patrol near a frozen creek, slaying 4 and capturing 1 who surrendered. The captive, under threat of an Umber blade, confessed that Roose Bolton had fewer than 1,000 men left at the castle, but rumors said Ramsay Snow, legitimized as Ramsay Bolton, was off in the countryside with yet more riders. It might be a trap. The captive could not say for sure, But if House Bolton planned to lure Robb's army in, they would need more than cunning illusions. Time, if nothing else, was not on their side. Their lines had been thinned by the rout at Winterfell. After a careful assessment, Robb called his captains together in a makeshift war council within a cluster of pines. They stood around a stump used as a table, upon which Jory Karstark unrolled a rough map of the region. The Dreadfort, drawn as a blocky shape, hugged a crook in the Weeping Water River. The land around it was mostly bleak fields and low hills. Hother Umber spit in disgust when he saw how little cover the region afforded. "Damn place is a fortress," he growled. "Walls as thick as a giant's thighs, or so my father used to say." Wylis Manderly shrugged. "Maybe so, but we hold the advantage in numbers now. We can surround them if we do it right. Starve them out." Robb's brow furrowed as he considered. "A siege is an option," he said, "but it could become protracted. They have their own supplies, presumably. In deep winter, a long siege endangers us as much as them, unless we control the water and ensure they get no relief. If Ramsay is out there with riders, we risk being harried from behind. On the other hand, a direct assault might cost too many lives. The Dreadfort is well named, and Bolton will not hesitate to butcher any who come near the walls." Gavin Glover drummed his fingers against the map. "We have men enough to attempt a two-pronged approach, a blockade and infiltration. If there's any hidden approach, perhaps from the river, we might slip a small force inside to open the gates at the right time." Jory Karstark nodded, remembering the infiltration at Winterfell itself. "I recall the old stories. The Dreadfort has a network of dungeons, but no one is sure if there's a secret passage out. Perhaps not. House Bolton seldom faced siege in living memory. They had no need for escape tunnels. Fear alone kept men away. Still, infiltration might be possible along the river if it's not too thick with ice." Hother Umber cracked his knuckles. "Or we smash them. This talk of infiltration is well and good, but the simplest way might be to knock at their gates with rams and towers. They're short on men, we outnumber them nearly 2-1. We rush the walls from all sides." Robb stared at the map, seeing multiple paths, none ideal. A winter siege might prove costly if it dragged. A direct assault risked many dead. But if infiltration failed, it might gain them nothing. "We proceed carefully," he said at last. "We'll approach the Dreadfort and encamp out of crossbow range, building some defenses of our own. We'll test their readiness. If they're as diminished as the prisoner claimed, we might intimidate them into a quick surrender or a negotiated infiltration. If Roose refuses—" He paused, the memory of the man's pale eyes flickering in his mind. "Then we try to starve them or storm them as circumstances allow. We can also send riders to chase after any sign of Ramsay's men. Let's not ignore that threat." The others agreed, though no one believed that Roose Bolton would yield short of total defeat. The meeting ended with a sense of finality. In the days that followed, the host advanced with more caution, circling wide around potential ambush points. Scouts ventured ahead, risking silent kills if they encountered Bolton outriders. Twice more, small skirmishes erupted. Neither side gained much, but the Boltons lost men each time. The tension crackled in the frozen air. Gray Wind caught the scent of fear whenever they neared Bolton watchers, and his low growl seemed to hold the promise of retribution. At last, nearing the 10th day since leaving Winterfell, Robb and his companions glimpsed the Dreadfort from a ridge. Dawn's gray light revealed squat towers of dark stone rising from a ring of frosted fields, a wide moat or partial ditch encircling the fortress. The Weeping Water River snaked by, partially frozen, its current slow and sullen. Dark banners flew along the battlements, house guards that might once have displayed a partial alliance with the Starks, but now were wholly disavowed. Spikes jutted from the walls, though it was impossible at this distance to see if they bore fresh horrors. The sight sent a chill through many in Robb's party, men who recalled stories of House Bolton's cruelty. This was a place of flaying knives, pale steel, and silent dread. They made camp well beyond arrow range, in a dip of land scattered with a few leafless trees. War horns sounded from the Dreadfort, echoing across the bleak plain. A bitter wind gusted, carrying that faint note of challenge. Robb's men erected tents, posted watch lines, readied for the possibility that Bolton might sally out. But no sortie came. The fortress gates remained shut, the walls manned by watchful archers. In the flickering daylight, Robb could see no movement outside, only the swirl of gray cloaks on the ramparts. Word spread among the men. The final confrontation loomed. Fire pits were dug and ringed with stone, but no large fires were lit to avoid wasting fuel. Sentries kept constant vigil, bows at the ready. If Bolton attempted a night raid, they would be waiting. But the first night passed in tense quiet. The only sound was the hiss of wind across the snowy fields. At dawn, Robb gathered a small honor guard at the forefront of his camp. With Hother Umber, Wylis Manderley, Jory Karstark, and Gavin Glover, he rode a short distance toward the fortress. They stopped well short of the moat, the distance too great for easy arrow shots, but close enough that those on the walls could see and hear. A standard-bearer lifted the direwolf banner, and a trumpeter gave one clear blast. Moments later, a figure appeared on the battlements, slender in posture, flanked by men with crossbows. Even from this distance, Robb recognized the outline of Lord Roose Bolton, black-clad, pale-faced, exuding that aura of calm menace. Robb raised his voice, letting it carry across the cold expanse. "Roose Bolton, I am Robb Stark, King in the North. I call upon you to yield the dread fort and face justice for your treacheries." Silence. Then Bolton's voice drifted back, thin but distinct. "King in the North, is it? Still clinging to that title? The realm knows better. You might have retaken Winterfell, but you'll not have this castle. Begone. We have no parley for oathbreakers." Robb's rage simmered, remembering how Bolton had spoken with the same calm in the war councils long ago, concealing treachery behind an emotionless mask. He forced steadiness. "I need no parley with murderers. If you refuse to yield, we'll take the Dreadfort by force. Your men will die for your ambition. Their blood is on your hands." Bolton's reply was as cold as the wind. "I've shed enough blood for a lifetime, boy. If you wish to hurl more men onto these walls, be my guest. You'll find we have provisions enough for a long siege, and the winter is not your ally. Turn back, and I might let you slink away." A faint snarl built in Robb's throat. Gray Wind, standing near the horse, bared his teeth at the silhouette above. "Then so be it," Robb shouted. "I offer no quarter to traitors, so recall that if you beg for mercy later." He wheeled his horse around, spurring it back to camp. The others followed. No volley of arrows pursued them. Roose Bolton was not so foolish as to waste shots at that range, but he had made his defiance clear. That day, Robb's men began digging in. They established a perimeter, ringed with sharpened stakes to deter cavalry. Teams ventured around the flanks of the Dreadfort to identify supply routes or hidden posterns. In late afternoon, Jory Karstark returned from a scouting run to report that the fortress's eastern approach was guarded by a higher wall segment with archers perched behind murder holes. The south was largely the weeping water, swirling with half-broken ice. Potentially, it might be passable, but the flow was unpredictable. The north side had fewer towers but offered open ground for archers on the parapets. In short, the place would be no easy conquest. The first night after that standoff passed with only minor skirmishes. Bolton archers loosed a few arrows, but no major sally. Robb's raiders probed the edges, testing for weaknesses. They found none. Frustration simmered among the allied northerners. Hother Umber openly proposed building siege towers and rams, launching an immediate assault. Others pressed for an infiltration plan. Robb listened to all but hesitated, weighing the cost in lives. Then fresh reports arrived. Ramsay Bolton had returned, slipping into the fortress with perhaps 100 riders. The watchers spotted them at dusk, galloping across the plain, rising a column of snowy dust behind them. They reached the gates, which opened briefly to admit them. That closure signaled the castle's full readiness. Now father and son stood united behind those walls, infamous for sadism and cunning. The watchers on the ramparts doubled. Robb spent a restless night in his tent, gray wind alert outside. He pictured the butcheries that might unfold if House Bolton were left to remain in power. The red wedding, the flayed corpses on battered barns, the horrors inflicted upon common folk. He could not rest until the Boltons were undone. As the howling wind lulled him into a half-sleep, he dreamt of the crypts beneath Winterfell and the faint echo of his father's voice telling him to finish what he had begun. By dawn, he resolved that they must act, or risk the campaign dragging through the worst of winter. Each week sapped resources. The men would not endure a half-year siege unless forced. So the time had come to force Roose Bolton's hand. He convened a war council at sunrise, under a large canvas pavilion in the center of camp. The sky was overcast, threatening more snow. Hother Umber stomped inside, shaking off frost, while Wylis Manderly rubbed his hands for warmth. Gavin Glover and Jory Karstark arrived with maps. Crude diagrams of the Dreadfort's walls lay pinned beneath stones. Robb straightened, a quiet intensity in his bearing. "We attempt a partial siege," he said, voice carrying. "We place forces at the main gate, the eastern gate, and the north approach, cutting off as many supply lines as we can. Meanwhile, we'll begin constructing siege ladders and perhaps a few towers with the timber we have. It won't be elegant, but if we can scale at least one section of the wall, we can create a breach. If Bolton commits men to stop us, that might give another group a chance to infiltrate from the river or wherever we find a weakness." Jory Karstark frowned. "That's a high cost, Your Grace. We'll lose men in the climb. They'll have boiling pitch or arrows from above." "I know," Robb murmured, "but we can't starve them out indefinitely. And if we show them a credible threat of assault, maybe Bolton's men will break. They can't all be so loyal. Some might surrender. Their morale must be low after the defeat at Winterfell." He looked to the others. "Are you with me on this?" One by one, they nodded. Hother Umber slammed a fist to his chest. "I'll lead the first wave if you like. The Boltons will feel an Umber's wrath." Wylis Manderly agreed that a two-pronged approach might corner the defenders. Gavin Glover pointed out that infiltration along the river could be feasible if the ice broke in their favor. The Boltons might not expect an assault from the waterside. That, however, depended on the thickness of the ice and the men's ability to cross. They set to work. Within the next day, the allied Northmen hauled in what wood they could salvage from the surrounding terrain. Men in the camp hammered together frames for tall ladders, their breath steaming. Others shaped the bases for rams, though they had to improvise for wheels in the deep snow. The labor was exhausting, fingers numb from cold, axes chipping. Some of the men cursed that they hadn't the time or resources to build standard siege engines, but they persevered. Robb walked among them, encouraging their efforts, reminding them that with each nail hammered, they closed the circle around the Boltons. Meanwhile, small parties patrolled to ensure Ramsay's riders did not slip out to burn the siege works. But the Boltons seemed content to remain behind the walls, occasionally firing crossbow bolts at any who ventured too close. As time passed, a sense of coiling tension built in both camps. Everyone knew a major clash was coming. On the third day of siege preparations, the men were startled by the ominous ring of horns from the Dreadfort's ramparts. Robb, in mid-discussion with Wylis Manderly, looked up to see a cluster of silhouettes on the walls. One bore the flayed man banner. Another waved something bright and torn, a shape that twisted in the wind. Robb's stomach lurched as he recognized the battered remains of a dire wolf sigil. The Boltons must have captured a Stark banner or made a mockery of it. The figure on the wall lifted the shredded cloth high, then hurled it into the moat. Cruel laughter drifted, faint but distinct. The men around Robb bristled in outrage. Gavin Glover spat curses. Hother Umber clenched his fists, roaring that he would tear down the gates. Wylis Manderly muttered that the Boltons had gone too far. Robb took a measured breath, forcing his anger to remain a cold edge rather than a reckless fury. This was a provocation. They wanted him to waste men in a hasty attack. He would not be goaded. Instead, he called for calm. "They mock us," Robb said quietly, "but we know their end is near. Let them waste their scorn. We'll respond on our terms, not theirs." He turned to a group of archers. Keep watch. If they make any move beyond insults, answer in kind. Otherwise, hold. That night, shadows shifted around the Allied camp as the men tested a new guard schedule. Some were assigned to stand watch with braziers for warmth. Others labored by lamplight to finish the siege ladders. All the while, a hush hovered on the fields, broken only by the occasional wail of wind. Robb paced through the lines, gray wind at his side, ensuring all was in readiness. He recalled the lessons from earlier battles. Do not underestimate an enemy who can strike at night. But the Boltons did not come. Instead, far across the plain, the fortress torches flickered. Perhaps Roose Bolton preferred to let the defenders rest, confident in the strength of their walls. At dawn, the first part of Robb's plan unfolded. He led 200 men around to the northern approach, forming a line that displayed ladders in broad daylight, as though preparing for a direct assault. Drums boomed as they advanced close enough to threaten. Bolton archers peppered them with arrows from the ramparts, though the distance reduced accuracy. Meanwhile, a second force under Wylis Manderley and Hother Umber made for the eastern gate, brandishing a crude battering ram to suggest they might break through. Crossbows from the walls met them, the air filled with the hiss of bolts, the clatter of shafts. Striking shields, men in the Allied host huddled behind mantlets, wooden screens, pushing forward a little at a time. Inside the fortress, confusion must have run rampant. Robb hoped that Roose Bolton would commit defenders to these threatened points, pulling men away from the other sides. Then Gavin Glover's infiltration team, 20 skilled swimmers and huntsmen, attempted to slip around to the partially frozen weeping water. They waited for a signal, hugging the riverbank's broken ice. If they could cross stealthily, they might find an unguarded postern or a sally port. If they succeeded, they could open the gates from within, or at least so panic. But the dread fort had not stood for centuries without cunning. As Gavin Glover's men crept onto the ice, stepping lightly to avoid cracking, a hidden watchman in a tower raised an alarm. Boiling pitch rained down from an overhead chute near the water's edge, splashing onto the ice and setting it aflame with some vile mixture of tar and oil. Half the infiltration team scattered in horror as flames licked across the ice, the heat melting patches, dropping men into the frigid water. Screams rose, echoing. Gray shapes in the tower rained arrows. Of the infiltration group, only a handful managed to scramble back to safety, shivering and half-burned. Gavin Glover himself took a crossbow bolt in the thigh, cursing as his men dragged him from the river's bank. Their attempt to slip inside had failed, at least for now. Meanwhile, at the north and east walls, Robb's feint turned into a grisly standoff. The Allied forces stood behind mantlets while Bolton archers took potshots. A few men began climbing ladders, testing the defenses. Each time, crossbow bolts forced them back. Through arrow slits, the defenders hurled stones and pots of scalding water. The casualties, though not massive, stung. Robb withdrew his men before midday, deciding that a prolonged exchange would only feed the Dreadfort's sense of superiority. He returned to camp grim-faced. In the aftermath, he joined the medics who were tending to Gavin Glover's wound. The man lay on a pallet of blankets, pale from blood loss, while a huntsman carefully probed the bolt lodged in his leg. Glover refused any sedation beyond a gulp of ale, gasping in pain as the bolt was drawn out. Robb knelt beside him, eyes dark with regret. "We misjudged their vigilance," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Glover clenched his teeth, sweat beading on his brow. "No apology, Your Grace. War is war. We gave it a try. The Boltons fight like devils in their lair." He let out a shaky breath. "But let me heal, and I'll climb those walls myself if you ask." Robb gripped his hand. "Rest, Gavin. We need you well. We'll find another way." Yet the question of how weighed heavily as the day wore on. Men shivered in the open wind, morale shaken by the fortress's brutal response. Ramsay's presence likely made it worse. That bastard was rumored to relish the chance to pour boiling pitch and mock any attacker. Wylis Manderley cursed at the idea of continuing to waste men in half measures. Hother Umber demanded a full, furious assault at dawn. Jory Karstark worried that such a direct approach might cost hundreds of lives. Robb weighed every counsel, torn between the urgency of finishing the Boltons and the cost in blood. That evening, as a gray dusk settled, one of the Allied outriders came galloping into camp with a prisoner in tow. A Bolton deserter, it seemed, who had tied a rag of surrender to his spear. The deserter, an older soldier with trembling hands, claimed that the men within the Dreadfort were on edge, many half-starved or terrified of Ramsay's cruelty. He said that while the fortress had stores enough for a moderate siege, the bastard of Bolton was using a heavy hand on any who showed doubt. Morale was crumbling. The deserter also suggested a possible vulnerability in the southwestern tower, which had partially collapsed years ago and been hastily repaired with wood. The man didn't know if it was guarded heavily, but he suspected it might be weaker than the main walls. Robb interrogated the deserter carefully, mindful that it could be a trick. The soldier flinched at every question, insisting he had no love for Bolton after watching friends flayed for petty crimes. In the end, Robb took the information under advisement, conferring with Jory Karstark and Wylis Manderly. If that southwestern tower was indeed a weak link, perhaps a midnight infiltration or a quick assault there could force a wedge inside. They planned swiftly, deciding on a twofold approach for that very night. Under cover of darkness, they would mount a diversion on the far northern wall, rattling sabers, raising torches, perhaps even starting small fires near that side. Meanwhile, a hand-picked strike force of 50 men, led by Hother Umber and assisted by a handful of scouts, would circle around to the southwestern tower. Robb would join them, unwilling to send others into danger while he lingered in camp. If they could breach the tower swiftly, they might get inside the fortress walls before the defenders fully rallied. Then they could force open a postern gate or even climb the inner ramparts, turning the Boltons' own defenses against them. It was desperate, but so was the entire campaign. As night fell, a dim moon hid behind clouds, leaving the fortress shapes in black silhouette. The wind had calmed to a low moan, and drifting snow muffled each footstep. Robb donned dark leathers beneath a fur cloak, discarding heavier plate to move more quietly. He carried his sword, plus a short-handled axe in case they needed to hack through barriers. Gray wind padded close, eyes gleaming in the darkness, though Robb debated whether to bring him on such a stealth mission. Ultimately, he could not leave the dire wolf behind. Gray wind had proven invaluable in the darkest struggles. The Umber men, similarly, wore black or gray cloaks. They removed any bright sigils or metal that might glint. Jory Karstark remained in the main camp to command the diversion, along with Wylis Manderly. Around midnight, the Allied camp horns gave a low series of notes. The Northern Watchers might suspect another general assault, but that was exactly what Robb wanted them to think. Shadows flickered to the north as Karstark's men lit torches and advanced partway toward the walls, banging shields. Shouts rose. Bolton archers responded with arrow fire. The thunder of war drums shook the cold air. Meanwhile, Robb's infiltration party moved along the southwestern perimeter, hugging the dark. Hother Umber led the vanguard, muttering oaths under his breath. A half-dozen scouts followed, scanning for watchers on the battlements. They crossed a shallow ditch, wincing at each crunch of crusted snow. The moat on this side was narrower, partially frozen, and the southwestern tower loomed just beyond. The deserter claimed the stone beneath that tower had been patched with wood after some collapse. If they could reach it, perhaps they could pry or burn a hole. They reached the edge of the moat. A single Bolton guard post was visible above, torchlight flickering. One guard stared outward, but his attention seemed mostly drawn to the commotion on the far side of the fortress. Robb silently signaled. 2 Umber archers raised bows. Their arrows loosed with soft twangs, and the Bolton guard dropped without a cry, a shaft through his throat. The second guard was slower to react, stumbling into view. Another arrow took him in the chest. He collapsed, torch dropping behind the parapet. The southwestern tower fell still. Quietly, the men crept onto the frozen moat. The ice groaned ominously beneath some of the heavier Umbers, but they moved in small clusters to distribute weight. At last, they reached the foot of the tower. Indeed, The stone near the base was haphazardly reinforced with thick timbers, some iron brackets hammered in place. A handful of new arrows from the allied archers overhead scoured the rampart, ensuring no hidden watchers would lean out. Hother Umber pressed a gauntlet hand to the timbers. "They're old. We can tear them free or set them ablaze," he whispered. Robb crouched close, ignoring the cold that numbed his fingers. "If we burn them, we risk alerting the entire castle. Tearing might be quieter, but we need enough time." He gestured for the men with pry bars to come forward. Gray wind sniffed the air, silent but poised. Two men wedged iron bars under the timbers, straining. The wood groaned. Another jammed a hatchet in to chip at the rotted sections. Slowly, piece by piece, they pried the boards away. The labor felt agonizingly long, each scraping noise threatening to draw attention. Above, the archers signaled that all remained quiet on this side. The main fighting noises continued in the distance. The infiltration team worked with frantic care, hearts pounding. At last, a large timber broke free, revealing a gap in the stone behind it. Cracked masonry that left a cavity perhaps wide enough to squeeze through. Hother Umber yanked out crumbling mortar with his dagger, widening the aperture. Robb joined him, hacking at a layer of half-frozen clay. A chunk fell inward, rattling. They paused, breath held, but no alarm came. When the gap was finally large enough, Hother Umber pressed forward first, twisting his broad shoulders. Two more men followed. Then Robb, carefully handing Gray Wind through after him. The wolf scrambled in with a low growl, nails scraping on stone. About half the infiltration party squeezed inside, while the remainder remained outside, keeping a rope line taut in case a quick retreat was needed. Within, they found themselves in a cramped storage area at the base of the tower. The air smelled of mildew and stale straw. Crates lined one wall. A narrow door led deeper into the fortress. Torchlight glowed faintly from beyond. The men readied weapons. Robb's heart hammered, recalling the infiltration at Winterfell. Only now, House Bolton was far more prepared. If they discovered this breach, a wave of crossbowmen could finish them in minutes. Hother signaled for a pair of scouts to edge the door open. The corridor beyond was dimly lit, with a single sconce flickering. No one stood guard here, likely because the southwestern tower was considered a lesser vulnerability. The fortress was ancient, full of corners and passageways. They advanced in a tight line, boots muffled on damp stone. At intervals, they passed closed doors, hearing distant commotion from the far side of the fortress, presumably where Karstark's diversion persisted. From above, footsteps clanged, guards pacing. Twice they flattened themselves against the walls as a Bolton soldier hurried past at an intersection. In each case, the infiltration party ambushed swiftly, knives drawn. One soldier died with a strangled cry. The other was seized, a hand clamped over his mouth, and quietly stabbed. Gray Wind prowled near Robb, senses alert. In the flickering gloom, the direwolf's eyes shone gold. Occasionally, the wolf would freeze, ears pricked, warning the men to wait before rounding a corner. Each time, they avoided patrolling guards. The castle's labyrinth of hallways reeked of damp and smoke. Strange echoes drifted, clanging from somewhere above, faint moans. Robb felt his spine tingle. The Dreadfort's dungeons had a savage reputation. Once they seized control, they might find horrors below. Gradually, they made for the gatehouse area, hoping to open a sally port or raise the portcullis. If successful, allied men from outside could flood in. But first, they had to find it. The infiltration group moved through a winding corridor that sloped downward, suspecting the route might lead to the main courtyard entrance. Partway along, a door banged open ahead, torchlight spilling. A cluster of Bolton soldiers emerged, half a dozen, talking in tense voices about the northern assault. They spotted the infiltration group at once, shouts of alarm bursting forth. In an instant, steel rang on steel. Hother Umber roared, swinging an axe. One Bolton soldier went down, skull cloven. Another tried to backpedal and call for help. Robb lunged, slamming the man's shield aside with his own, then drove his sword through the soldier's belly. The corridor flared with the smell of blood. Gray Wind leapt at two men in the rear, knocking them back in a flurry of teeth and savage snarls. The men screamed as fangs tore flesh. Yet the last Bolton soldier had presence of mind to bellow, "Intruders in the tower!" before a thrust from an umber spear dropped him. That cry echoed. The infiltration team had lost the element of stealth. Robb cursed under his breath, ordering them forward. If they lingered, more guards would arrive. They rushed onward, stepping over bodies, smears of blood marking the stones. At a juncture, they heard footsteps approaching from the left. Reinforcement. Gray Wind growled, hackles raised. Hother Umber hollered, "This way!" and barreled to the right, leading them down another corridor that reeked of old decay. Torches smoked in wall brackets. A door stood at the far end. Perhaps it led to the gate controls. Before they could reach it, a handful of crossbowmen rounded a corner. Arrows whirred. One of Robb's men took a bolt in the neck, collapsing with a gargle. Another was struck in the shoulder. The infiltration party ducked behind a row of crates stacked against the corridor's wall. Robb flattened himself, hearing the crossbow cranks as they reloaded. Hother Umber snarled, "Someone get a flaming brand and hurl it at them." One of the men seized a torch from the sconce, stepped out, and flung it down the corridor. The crossbowman dodged, arrows flying wide. Gray Wind darted forward under the cover of confusion, snapping at a man's ankle. The crossbowman toppled with a shriek. Umber men charged, finishing the rest in close combat. They advanced again, hearts pounding. Robb's arm throbbed from a glancing blow on his shield. The infiltration had turned into a running fight. At last, they reached the far door and shoved it open, revealing a stairwell that spiraled upward. From the architecture, it likely led to an upper gate mechanism. Hother Umber rumbled, "Up we go quickly!" But then the door behind them burst open anew. A fresh wave of Bolton guards poured in, 8 or 9 men, some brandishing swords, others leveling spears. Leading them was a lean figure wearing black furs, a sneer contorting his face. Ramsay Bolton. His pale eyes flicked over Robb's group with undisguised malice. "So the little wolf tries to creep in," he said, voice mocking. "I had hoped we'd meet again, Your Grace, but this ends here." Men lunged forward. The corridor erupted in steel. The infiltration group was caught between the stairwell and Ramsay's squad. Hother Umber roared, hacking at a spear-laden soldier. Another Umber tried to engage Ramsay, but the bastard sidestepped with surprising agility, slashing the man's throat. Blood sprayed. Ramsay's grin was feral as he pressed the assault. 2 more Bolton men rushed Robb. He parried the first, hearing steel ring in the enclosed space, the clang amplified. The second soldier swung from Robb's flank, but Gray Wind snapped at the soldier's leg, staggering him enough for Robb to drive his sword home. The soldier collapsed. At the corner of his vision, Robb saw Ramsay grappling with a wounded Umber, twisting a dagger into the man's gut. Another soldier tried to stab Gray Wind from behind, but the direwolf spun, jaws clamping on the attacker's wrist. Chaos reigned. The corridor was cramped, blood spattered, men shouting curses, weapons colliding in lethal arcs. Ramsay maneuvered with a snake-like fluidity. The bastard of Bolton showed no fear, only delight in the violence. Hother Umber managed to land a blow on Ramsay's side with an axe, but the angle was poor, deflecting off a layer of chain. Ramsay hissed in pain but retreated a step, eyes gleaming with hateful amusement. Robb advanced, locking eyes with the man who had seized Winterfell in the name of torment, who had haunted the north with flayed corpses. "Your father will hang, and so will you," Robb spat, raising his sword. "That's a promise." Ramsay's lip curled. "I'll feed your wolf your own entrails first." They clashed, swords ringing. Ramsay was quick, circling to Robb's offhand side, forcing Robb to pivot. Sparks flew. The corridor gave little room for footwork. Gray Wind snapped at Ramsay's leg, but the bastard darted away, lashing out at the wolf's muzzle with the edge of his blade. Gray Wind snarled, dancing back. A Bolton soldier lunged at the wolf, trying to protect Ramsay. Gray Wind tore out the man's throat in a heartbeat, blood splattering the stone. Meanwhile, Ramsay seized the moment to lunge at Robb's chest. Robb twisted aside, feeling the graze of steel across his mail. He retaliated with a downward slash, forcing Ramsay to skip back. The infiltration men fought the rest of Ramsay's squad. Hother Umber pitted raw strength against two foes, burying his axe in one soldier's collarbone while grappling the other. The corridor floor became a slick of gore and half-burnt torch drippings. The reek of blood, sweat, and fear pressed upon them all. Ramsay glided back further, a cunning glint in his eyes, as though calculating odds. Then he barked an order, "Fall back! Hold them here!" to the men behind him. Realizing he might be outnumbered, he retreated along the corridor, leaving his subordinates to die. The infiltration group tried to press forward, but the last few Bolton men locked shields, forming a desperate barrier. More crossbow bolts hissed from a side passage, forcing Robb's men to duck. "Up the stairs!" Robb shouted to Hother. "We'll be trapped if we stay here." They had not come for a pitched brawl in a hallway, they needed the gate mechanism. The infiltration force pivoted to the stairwell, dragging their wounded. Arrows clattered off stone. Gray wind bounded ahead, leading the way. Robb followed with a clenched jaw, hearing the screams of men locked in the corridor behind him. They had lost perhaps half their number. If they did not accomplish the objective, their sacrifice would be for naught. The spiral stair was narrow, lit only by the occasional wall sconce. They climbed at a run, hearts pounding, ignoring the moans of the injured. One Umber man, gasping from a gut wound, insisted he could still fight, but collapsed 2 steps later. They left him with a companion, urging them to hold as best they could. Another flight of steps, then an iron-banded door blocked the path. Hother bashed it with his shoulder, cursing as it rattled but did not yield. Robb joined, the two of them throwing their weight. Gray wind whined, pawing at the threshold. Finally, an Umber battered it with a warhammer, splintering the latch. The door banged open. Beyond lay a small guardroom with a row of levers and chains, likely connected to the portcullis or a drawbridge. 2 startled Bolton guards leapt up from stools, only to be set upon by gray wind. One tried to draw a sword, but the wolf's jaws closed on his wrist. The other dropped his spear in terror, stumbling back. Hother shoved him aside with a snarl, sending him crashing into a wall. Robb rushed to the levers, trying to recall how gate mechanisms worked. Some were for the main gate, others for smaller sally ports. The men hammered a few wooden braces to keep the door shut behind them. They heard pounding from the stairwell as Bolton soldiers closed in. One of Robb's men found a gear that whirred when turned, presumably lifting the portcullis. Hother yanked another chain, feeling it give. Distantly, they heard a grinding of metal from the courtyard. The infiltration men cheered in ragged relief. If the main gate was rising, that might allow the Allied forces, currently feigning an assault at the northern side, to rush in from the front. Or so they hoped. The question was whether the Allied men would realize the gate was open in time, or whether the Boltons would notice and slam it shut. Another chain likely controlled the drawbridge or some interior port, so Hother gave it a heave. More scraping noises echoed through the walls. "Barricade that door," Robb ordered, pointing. The infiltration men dragged a heavy table across the chamber, wedging it. The Bolton guard who had dropped his spear cowered in the corner, arms raised in surrender. Gray wind snarled at him, muzzle dripping. Robb pinned the man with a glare. "Stay put if you value your life," he snapped, then turned to check the mechanism again. Indeed, one chain spun slowly, meaning the portcullis was up. Possibly a bridging mechanism as well. They needed to hold this guardroom long enough for their allies to exploit the opening. Footsteps thundered on the stairs. The door behind them buckled under repeated impacts. Bolts from a crossbow punched through the wood, quivering in the table that blocked it. Hother Umber readied his axe, panting from exertion and blood loss. One of the infiltration men coughed, pressing a hand to a slashed thigh. Robb realized they could not stand indefinite assault here. They were too few, but if they abandoned the guardroom, the Boltons would retake the controls, slamming the gate. They had to hold as long as possible. Meanwhile, outside in the chilly night, the Allied forces near the gates must have noticed the portcullis lifting. Indeed, at that moment, Jory Karstark and Wilas Manderly, leading a contingent at the fortress's front, saw the bars rise. Shouts of excitement spread. They signaled a general charge. Men bearing torches and wooden mantlets rushed forward, crossing the moat over a partially frozen drawbridge that had begun to lower. Bolton archers on the walls fired desperately, but the Allied men pressed on. A great clamor shook the courtyard as the first of them flooded inside, swords raised. Within the guardroom, Robb heard the muffled roars of battle echoing from below. Good. Allies had made it in. If they could punch through the courtyard, they might overrun the fortress in short order. But to do so, they needed to keep the gate open. The infiltration men braced themselves behind the table, gripping weapons. The door shuddered again. A final crash tore it from its hinges, sending splinters everywhere. Bolton soldiers poured in, crossbows raised. Umber men hurled themselves forward, taking bolts in their cloaks. One screeched, a quarrel lodged in his collar. Another fell stone dead with a bolt in the eye. Robb and Hother bellowed, leading a desperate melee. Steel clashed in the cramped guardroom. Grey Wind lunged at a crossbowman, dragging him down with savage efficiency. Another soldier thrust a spear at Robb, who battered it aside with his shield, then slashed the man across the throat. Blood splattered the stone floor. Hother Umber traded heavy blows with two enemies at once, hacking into one's torso with an agonized roar. The second soldier stabbed Hother in the side, but the big Umber man ignored it, caving the soldier's head in with the axe. The corridor behind the Bolton wave was jammed with more men, but they could not all push in at once. In that swirl of carnage, Ramsay Bolton reappeared, a crossbow in hand, sliding around the edge of the doorway. His hair was damp with sweat, face twisted in an ugly grin. He raised the crossbow, aiming at Robb. Grey Wind, engaged with another foe, could not intervene swiftly enough. Robb turned in time to see Ramsay's finger tighten on the trigger. The click rang out, but the shot flew wide. Hother Umber had hurled his axe, the weapon spinning through the air. Its haft cracked into Ramsay's arm, spoiling his aim. The bolt slammed into the wall behind Robb. Ramsay cursed, flinging the crossbow aside. He drew a curved knife, ignoring the blood trickling from where the axe handle had clipped him. "Tiresome," Ramsay hissed, stepping over corpses. His gaze latched onto Robb. "You and that wolf of yours have cost me enough. No more." Robb advanced, sword raised, breath coming in ragged bursts. "Your father's doom is sealed, and so is yours. Yield if you value your life." Ramsay laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "I don't yield." He fainted low, then lunged with the knife. Robb barely deflected it, feeling the blade scrape his mail. The corridor pressed on all sides. Another Bolton soldier tried to thrust a spear, but Robb pivoted, letting Grey Wind clamp onto the man's leg. Freed from the immediate threat, Robb returned his focus to Ramsay, who sidestepped over the twitching bodies, seeking an opening. They exchanged a flurry of blows. Ramsay was quick, capitalizing on the cramped space. Robb's heavier sword could not match the speed of Ramsay's dagger in close quarters. But Robb had a shield and the advantage of reach. He bashed forward, forcing Ramsay to dodge. The bastard's grin shifted to a snarl of concentration. Another slash cut across Robb's forearm, drawing blood where the mail parted at the elbow joint. Robb winced but pressed on, smashing the shield's rim into Ramsay's ribs. A hiss of pain escaped Ramsay's lips, though he twisted away, hooking the dagger at Robb's side. The blade bit painfully, but not deep. The swirl of motion put them nearly chest to chest. Grey Wind, finishing the other soldier, sprang to help, but Ramsay pivoted, placing Robb between them. In that second, Robb remembered the red wedding sense of betrayal, the cost of Bolton treachery. He roared in fury, driving his sword in a savage thrust. Ramsay tried to jerk aside, but the steel caught him high in the chest. The bastard gasped, eyes bulging. His dagger clattered to the stone. Blood bubbled on his lips. With a final sputtering breath, he collapsed, sliding off the blade. Robb staggered, chest heaving, gray spots dancing in his vision. But Ramsay Bolton was finished. Hother Umber gave a harsh laugh, though he bled from multiple wounds. "Well struck," he growled. Then he sank to a knee, panting. Gray wind sniffed Ramsay's corpse, muzzle wrinkling. The handful of Bolton men still alive at the threshold saw their dreaded bastard fall. Some turned to flee, others lowered weapons in stunned horror. The infiltration group, battered beyond measure, held the guardroom. The gate remained open. Then the final tide of battle arrived, as allied men from the courtyard poured up the corridors, sweeping aside the last pockets of Bolton resistance. Word spread like wildfire. Ramsay Bolton was slain. A surge of Stark and Manderley men seized hallways, kicked in doors, corralled the cowering defenders. Robb refused to sink to pointless butchery. Men who threw down arms were taken prisoner. But the loyal henchmen who fought on were cut down. Step by step, the Dreadfort fell. In the courtyard, Hother Umber's standard joined the Direwolf banner. Jory Karstark and Wylis Manderley arrived from the main gate area. Finding the infiltration survivors, among them Robb, slumped in exhaustion. Caked in blood, Robb sank onto a broken crate, gray wind leaning against him. Hother Umber coughed, pressing a hand to his side. Jory knelt beside them, calling for medics. The sky above began to lighten with the approach of dawn, revealing the Dreadfort's bleak walls, a battered ruin in places, stained with fresh carnage. Overhead, the flayed man banner was torn down by a group of Karstark archers. They hoisted the Stark banner in its place. Cheers broke out among the allied men, though it was a raw, weary sound. In the corner of the courtyard, a cluster of captives stood with heads bowed. "Where is Roose Bolton?" Robb asked, forcing himself upright. Soldiers shook their heads, uncertain. Some said they had glimpsed him near the central keep. Others rumored he fled deeper into the fortress. Robb gritted his teeth, ignoring the burn of his wounds. "We finished this." A group led by Wylis Manderley stormed the keep, scouring corridors and bedchambers. They found the place half deserted, furniture upturned, stores raided. In the largest hall, they discovered men who had surrendered, dropping swords at the sight of the Direwolf banner. But no sign of Roose. At last, near a locked passage leading to the dungeons, they glimpsed a figure creeping through the gloom, clad in black fur. Torchlight revealed the pale face of Roose Bolton. He clutched a sword in one hand, the other pressed to his side. Possibly wounded. His eyes flicked with that unnerving calm, yet beneath it, dread lurked. Wylis's knights advanced. Bolton raised his sword, mouth twisting. "You'll find no easy prisoner here." He lunged, but the knights easily disarmed him, smashing aside his guard. An Umber soldier struck him across the shoulder with a mace. Roose groaned and collapsed, the sword clanging away. Soldiers pinned him, tearing away his cloak and furs. Blood seeped from a cut under his ribs. The Warden of the North was undone at last. They dragged him into the courtyard, where Robb stood, leaning on a spear for balance. Hother Umber, Jory Karstark, and Wylis Manderley ringed around. The remaining allied men watched, faces set in grim lines. Roose Bolton knelt in the churned mud and snow, forcibly held. His typically emotionless visage had cracked with weariness and pain, but he still attempted a facade of composure. "So this is how it ends," Bolton murmured. "You fancy yourself king in the ashes, I suppose. The Lannisters will not stand for it." Robb's voice was cold. "The Lannisters are far away, and you are here, stripped of your power. Did you expect mercy after all you've done?" Bolton's eyes flickered. "Mercy? I expected cunning. Mercy is not the North's way in war, not truly. But I do not beg. I only regret that Walder Frey remains, and you remain, while so many good men died." He drew a shaky breath. "Kill me then if you have the courage. Or perhaps you'll try to ransom me." Hother Umber spat. "Ransom? After the Red Wedding and all your flangs? You deserve the headsman." Robb nodded slowly, heart pounding. Yet some part of him recalled his father's code of justice. He who passes the sentence should swing the sword. That had been Ned Stark's creed. The entire courtyard was silent. Grey wind bared his teeth at the kneeling lord. Bolts of pain in Robb's side and arm threatened to unman him, but he summoned the final vestige of strength. He owed the North a final closure to Bolton's treachery. "Roose Bolton," Robb said, voice resonating. "You stand condemned for high treason, for murder at the Twins, for atrocities against the people of the North, for betraying your oaths. By my right as king in the North, I sentence you to die." Bolton looked at him without a flicker of fear, only that perpetual iciness. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, resigned. Robb motioned for the men to clear space. 2 Umber soldiers forced Roose to his feet, leading him a few paces from the cluster, where the ground lay thick with snow. In the old northern tradition, Robb accepted a headsman's sword offered by Jory Karstark. It was heavy, not quite the Valyrian steel of ice that his father had once wielded, but it would suffice. Bolton knelt again, bowing his neck. Robb lifted the sword, ignoring the throbbing in his battered limbs. A hush held the courtyard as a gray dawn spread overhead. Then, in a swift, brutal arc, Robb swung. The blade cut cleanly, taking Roose Bolton's head. Blood spurted, steaming in the winter air. The body slumped forward, staining the snow red. Hother Umber exhaled, a savage satisfaction in his posture. Wylus Manderly bowed his head, murmuring a quiet prayer. The men around them released a collective sigh. One of them spat on Bolton's severed head, but Robb stilled him. He would not stoop to the flaying ways of his enemies. So ended the last lord of House Bolton, the man who had orchestrated one of the greatest betrayals in Northern history. In that moment, the Watchers might have expected Robb to feel triumphant. Instead, he felt only a hollow exhaustion. So much bloodshed had scarred the North. Though victory was theirs, the cost was immense. He let the sword slip from his fingers into the snow, sagging to a knee. Grey wind nudged him. Jory and Wylus rushed forward to support him, calling for a maester or a medic. The courtyard swirled with a strange mixture of cheers and lamentations for the fallen. Some men cried out in relief. Others cradled wounds, staring numbly at the gore-slick stones. They carried Robb to a relatively intact tower chamber. A pair of allied healers worked to bandage his arm and side, discovering shallow gashes and bruises. He lay still, eyes half-lidded from pain and weariness. Eventually, Hother Umber, Wylus Manderly, and Jory Karstark came to stand by him, reporting that the fortress was under full control. Surviving Bolton men who refused surrender had been hunted down in pockets, while the remainder had yielded. Ramsay was dead, Roose was dead, and the seat of House Bolton was now under Stark dominion. The war, at least in the north, might finally draw toward an end. Outside, men began disposing of bodies, dousing fires, dragging out the flayed man banners to burn them. A Stark banner was raised in the courtyard, though the place still reeked of old fear. The dungeons yielded captives, some half-mad from torture. They emerged blinking into the gray daylight, praising the Starks for deliverance. Wylus Manderly ordered rations distributed, while Jory Karstark organized cleanup details. Hother Umber, still nursing his wounds, personally kicked down a door to the old flaying hall, where he found horrifying instruments of torture. He demanded they be smashed to splinters. Word spread quickly among the allied men that both Boltons lay dead, father and bastard. The news would soon echo across the entire north. The Lannisters might protest, Walder Frey might rage, but the immediate threat within these lands was ended. House Bolton, the ancient rival of House Stark, was shattered at last. That evening, a hush settled over the Dreadfort as snowfall recommenced, covering the courtyard in a new white layer, trying to hide the bloodstains. Robb, limping but bandaged, insisted on walking the walls. Grey wind followed, muzzle pressed close to Robb's side in silent companionship. The ramparts were battered, crossbow bolts still lodged in the merlins. He gazed out at the wide plain, campfires flickering where allied soldiers bedded down. So many had lost their lives in this campaign, but the nightmares of Bolton rule were over. The North remembered indeed. From behind, Wylus Manderley approached quietly. "Your Grace," he said, voice thick with respect, "will bury the dead come morning. Some men propose we burn the remains of Bolton's line. Others wish to mount their heads on spikes. We await your word." Robb exhaled, thinking of Ned Stark's example once more. "Mount the traitors' heads if that is the northern custom. Let the realm see we do not suffer oath-breakers lightly. But bury the lesser men who fought for him, if they surrendered. Enough cruelty has been done in this land." Wylus nodded. "As you will." He hesitated. "And what of this castle? It's a place of dread. Do we keep a garrison here or raze it to the ground?" Robb's gaze trailed along the dark stone. The north was vast, and from times immemorial, the dread fort had served as House Bolton's seat. Now that Bolton was no more, the question of who would hold it was thorny. "We'll leave a garrison. The North cannot afford to let any seat become a bandit hold. But I do not plan to let the flayed man rise again. Perhaps another family, loyal to House Stark, can watch these lands. Or we dismantle parts of the fortress to rid it of its horrors." He rubbed at the bandage on his arm, feeling bone-deep fatigue. "But these decisions can wait. For tonight, post guards, search every nook for leftover traps. At first light, we'll handle the rest." Wylus bowed. "Yes, your Grace." He departed to see it done. Robb lingered, leaning against the parapet. Flurries landed on his hair, melting into rivulets down his cheeks. Gray wind nuzzled him. He placed a hand on the wolf's neck, remembering how close he'd come to losing everything. The red wedding, the heartbreak of betrayal, the savage battles culminating here. He closed his eyes, letting relief mingle with sorrow for all who had fallen. Talisa, Catelyn's torment, the many loyal Northmen slaughtered. Yet the future beckoned, no longer overshadowed by the flayed man's banner. In the distance, the hush of winter's night enfolded the battered fortress. By morning, the allied men gathered in the courtyard. They erected a row of pikes for the heads of the Boltons. Ramsay's twisted sneer now frozen in death. Roosa's pale features turned gray. Soldiers spat, cursed, or stared in grim fascination. Robb found no pleasure in the gruesome display, but tradition demanded a public accounting. Then, as snow thickened, they began building pyres or shallow trenches to bury the rest. The living roamed the fortress halls, prying open locked doors, reclaiming valuables stolen from northern houses. In a suite of rooms, they discovered stashes of furs, golden cups, even jewels that might have belonged to pillaged families. Robb decreed they be inventoried and eventually returned to rightful owners if possible. In the dungeons below, the men found instruments of flaying and implements too vile to name. The stench of old blood made some wretch. A few cowering prisoners were freed. Ragged, half-dead souls who sobbed in gratitude, though they would need time to recover from the horrors. Robb ordered the entire place scoured. Hother Umber took an axe to the flaying racks with fervor, splintering them as men cheered. In the gloom, a battered man wearing tattered gray clothes recognized Robb, mumbling that he had been seized for refusing to pay Bolton's taxes. Robb offered him fresh clothes and told him to seek solace in Winterfell's care if he wished. The grateful man wept. Throughout the day, stragglers from the Allied columns kept arriving, having missed the final fight. They expressed shock that the seat of House Bolton now flew the direwolf banner. Scouts ranged outward to confirm no more Bolton forces roamed free. They found scattered pockets of wounded men, some surrendering, others dying in the snow. By nightfall, the dread fort was firmly under Stark control, a hush descending on corridors once infamous for screams. Robb established a new command post in a less grim tower, setting up a meeting with Hother Umber, Wylus Manderley, Jory Karstark, and the other captains. Though many men were exhausted, they gathered around a broad table scavenged from a library. Candles flickered, revealing the battered and bandaged among them. Jory sported a deep cut on his cheek. Hother had a bandaged torso, still breathing in pained rasps. Robb's left arm throbbed, but he forced himself to maintain composure. They had to decide the future of the war and the North itself. Wylus Manderley cleared his throat. The Boltons are ended. That's a victory for all the North. But Walder Frey remains, as does the Iron Throne. If they learn you have triumphed here, they may send an army or demand your submission. What do we do? Robb's gaze swept the table. We hold the North. Winterfell is back under Stark rule, and now the Dreadfort as well. House Bolton was the primary threat that allowed the Freys to claim advantage. Without them, the Freys' hold on the crossing becomes tenuous. We can fortify Moat Cailin to block any approach from the south, or attempt to sec. Your alliances with Riverland lords who hate the Freys. The key is to keep them from uniting a southern host. Hother Umber grunted. And what of King Tommen's minions or Queen Cersei's wrath? If they send knights up the King's Road come spring, it could be a real fight. A faint smile tugged at Robb's lips, though tired. The Lannisters are spread thin by rumors of conflict in the south. Stannis, maybe Daenerys Targaryen across the sea. They might threaten, but it would take time to mount a full invasion. By then, we can rally the North behind us. Our position is stronger than ever. Let them try to cross the neck. I'll see them ground to dust. The men murmured approval. Jory Karstark ventured. We should communicate with loyal houses who hesitated. Now that the Boltons are gone, they may come to our side fully. And if you're amenable, we might forge new marriages or pacts to solidify your kingship. Robb nodded, though a pang of sorrow flickered at the thought of marriage alliances. He had lost much in that regard. Still, the North's stability might demand it. We'll consider those pacts, but let's focus first on ensuring every major seat is secured. The Umbers will want to reclaim Last Hearth from any Bolton-appointed steward. The Serwyns, the Tallhearts, each house can now breathe freer. Let us also see to the small folk who have suffered. We must not become a tyranny as the Boltons were. Wylus Manderley and the others nodded solemnly. Some men pounded their fists on the table in approval. This was the direction they had fought for. A unified North, free from the flayed man's terror. Their tasks were many: rebuilding roads, distributing supplies, restoring farmland if winter ever eased. But a spark of hope shone in each battered face. They would do it. They had survived the hardest test. The meeting broke up with renewed purpose. Men returned to their tasks or found corners to sleep. As the Dreadfort's new masters, they rummaged for bedding in old storerooms. Robb bedded down in the tower's largest chamber, scorched from some old accident, but with an intact roof. Gray wind curled at his feet. Catelyn was not here. She had remained in Winterfell, no doubt anxious to hear news of them. Robb resolved to send a swift rider in the morning to carry word that House Bolton was overthrown, that the king in the north stood triumphant. The dream that had nearly died at the Twins was alive again, realized in the final end of the Boltons. Roose and Ramsay were no more. The ghosts of the Red Wedding, though never fully exorcised, no longer overshadowed House Stark's survival. Robb sank into an exhausted sleep, dreaming of the crypts at Winterfell. This time, in his dream, Ned Stark stood smiling, sword in hand, not in condemnation but with quiet pride. The tombs were lit by torches, not shadow. When Robb woke, dawn's light faintly touched the chamber's broken shutters, and he felt a somber peace. Perhaps the old gods had blessed him with a father's approval, or maybe it was only a flicker of imagination. Still, he felt lighter. He rose, wincing at his injuries. Gray wind rose too, shaking out his fur. Outside, the courtyard glistened under a fresh layer of snow. Men walked among the wreckage, scraping ice from flagstones, removing bodies for burial. A moment's hush let Robb sense the possibility of a new beginning. The cost had been immense, but the North was no longer in the hands of traitors. After a quick meal of bread and salted fish, Robb assembled a small circle in the courtyard for a short ceremony. The heads of the Boltons still perched on pikes, grim testament to treachery's wages. Robb declared the Dreadfort under Stark rule for the time being, placing it under the guardianship of selected men from the Umbers, Manderleys, and Karstarks. He insisted on minimal cruelty to any local peasants who had served House Bolton out of fear. Only the chief conspirators in flaying and torture would be tried. The men around him clapped fists to hearts, swearing to uphold these orders. Scouts departed, fanning across the region to confirm that no hidden Bolton loyalists lurked. Others would ride to Winterfell, bearing the news to Catelyn and the rest of the north. Jory Karstark offered to lead one group. Hother Umber planned to remain a while longer, resting his wounds. Wylus Manderly likewise stayed, ensuring the fortress was stripped of any secret compartments. Robb took a final turn about the ramparts, gazing at the empty plains, thinking how the Boltons had dreamed of ruling the north. Now their seat was subdued. Within days, tidings of the victory spread. Messengers poured in from minor lords who, hearing of Bolton's demise, swore renewed fealty to House Stark. Some proposed sending food or men to the Dreadfort as a gesture. The savage battles were behind them, though the snows still raged. Each new message carried a thread of relief, a belief that the North could mend. Robb wrote back, urging each house to prepare for the next thaw, when roads might open and fresh threats from the south could manifest. But for the moment they had quiet. He also wrote personally to Catelyn at Winterfell, telling her that Roose Bolton's head spiked upon the walls was all the justice he could manage for the Red Wedding's treason. In that letter, he asked her to gather the lords for a grand assembly once the snows eased, so they could decide the shape of the North's future under the Stark banner. The days turned into a subdued but purposeful routine. Men cleared debris, sorted captive weapons, and destroyed every vestige of the flaying paraphernalia. The grimmest rooms were boarded up. A few battered peasants from the surrounding lands trickled in, warily hopeful that the new masters would not flay them. Robb welcomed them, offering what limited rations he could spare. Already, some corners of the castle felt less suffocating. The final exorcism was simply time. Time to let the ghosts of House Bolton fade. At last, after a fortnight of securing the region, Robb decided they could return to Winterfell with the bulk of their forces. A skeleton garrison would remain behind under a loyal deputy, an Umber named Guthard who'd served well in the final assault. This would ensure no opportunists reclaimed the Dreadfort. Robb, Hother Umber, Wylus Manderly, and the others would lead the majority south, rejoining the center of power. They planned to depart at dawn, a day that broke crisp and clear, with the sun shining pale gold on fresh-fallen snow. Before leaving, Robb made one final circuit of the courtyard, pausing by the pikes that held the Boltons' heads. He studied Roose Bolton's lifeless features, pale eyes half-lidded in death, mouth slack. Ramsay's face was caught in a final rictus of hatred. No more nightmares, no more flaying knives, Robb murmured half to himself. Gray wind sniffed the air, letting out a low growl. Robb quietly ordered the heads be taken down and burned, an end to the spectacle. If the North was to heal, dwelling on such gory trophies served little purpose. Mounted on a sturdy horse with his battered shield slung behind him, Robb led the column out of the Dreadfort gates. The men who remained saluted. Hother Umber, riding at Robb's side, cast a scornful glance at the fortress's grim silhouette. "I'll not miss this damned place, but we did what had to be done." Robb said softly. "We'll see better days ahead." He touched Grey Wind's fur, the wolf trotting near the front. The columns of men spread out across the snow, banners flapping in a light wind. Freed from Bolton's dominion, the land felt less ominous somehow, as though the land itself breathed relief. They carried the spoils of war, spare arms, a portion of the Dreadfort's stored grain, enough to help them through the final months of winter. The journey back south was arduous, the cold unrelenting, but men marched with lighter hearts. They recounted stories of the infiltration, praising each other's bravery, mourning the dead. Wylus Manderly joked that he had lost half a stone in weight from all the marching and fighting, and that was a feat for a Manderly. Some men teased that the king himself had a new set of scars to impress potential queens. Robb, half smiling, let them talk. He felt no laughter in his chest yet, but a sense of forward momentum carried him. He had a kingdom to rebuild and loved ones to see again. He wondered how his mother would greet the news that the Boltons were done forever, how the lords might convene in a new great council at Winterfell. Perhaps even the prospect of forging alliances with the Riverlands might come to pass. The dream of a united North, free from southern manipulations, glimmered in the distance. For the first time since the Red Wedding, that dream felt attainable. They pressed on through swirling snow. At each night's camp, men huddled around fires, speaking in subdued excitement about the tasks waiting in Winterfell. Some worried about the Iron Throne's eventual retaliation. Others insisted the Lannisters had bigger problems than retaking the North. Occasionally, Robb weighed in, reminding them they must remain vigilant. The North's independence might spark new conflicts, but for now, they had to restore their homelands. Even from a purely defensive stance, they were better off removing House Bolton. On the 8th day of the return march, they encountered a trio of Mountain Clan warriors on stout garrons. The clans had heard rumors of the Boltons' fall and came to see if it was true. Upon hearing confirmation from Robb himself, they bowed in their pragmatic way and offered their axes if ever the Starks needed them. Another sign that the realm was healing. Robb thanked them, urging them to gather more mountain folk for a future assembly at Winterfell. If a southern army ever came, the mountain clans would be crucial in harrying their flanks. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of Winterfell's domain. Smoke from chimneys signaled nearby villages. People emerged from huts, brightening at the sight of the returning host. Some carried simple gifts, dried mushrooms, bundles of pine branches. Word of the Boltons' defeat preceded them, so men hailed Robb as the true king in the North. He felt humbled, uncomfortable with the notion that he was now a figure of legend for surviving the Red Wedding and toppling 2 traitor houses. The illusions of heroism weighed on him, reminding him of how many had died to secure this outcome. At last, under a leaden sky, the towers of Winterfell appeared on the horizon. Fires glimmered within its walls. Robb's heart thumped with relief. The fortress was still battered, half-burned in places, but the banners of the direwolf flew proudly. No sign of siege lines, no sign of foes. The columns marched up to the gates, and horns sounded from the ramparts. The gates opened. A wave of cheering rose, for word had reached the castle that the Dreadfort was taken. Soldiers on the walls whooped to see their king's triumphant return. Gray wind barked an echo, bounding ahead through the snow. The courtyard filled with onlookers. Manderley knights who had remained, Umbers, Karstarks, local villagers. Everyone pressed forward to witness the moment. Catelyn stood at the center of the crowd, cloak whipping in the cold. The lines of worry on her face melted when she saw Robb, battered but alive. She rushed forward as he dismounted, throwing her arms around him despite the mail and furs. He winced at the pressure on his side, but returned the embrace fiercely. Neither spoke for a moment. Then, she drew back, tears bright in her eyes, searching his face. "You did it," she said. "The Boltons? Gone," he whispered. "Roose, Ramsay. House Bolton is no more." He glanced around at the cluster of onlookers, lifting his voice for them to hear. "We have reclaimed the North. Winterfell stands, the Dreadfort stands under Stark rule. The traitors are ended. Let all know that the wolves of Winterfell guard these lands once more." A surge of cheering rose, some men chanting Stark, others roared in savage delight at the Boltons' destruction. In that moment, Robb allowed himself a flicker of pride. His mother squeezed his arm, eyes shining not just with joy, but with a poignant sorrow for all they had lost. He nodded, understanding. The future was open, but the cost weighed heavily. Still, this victory meant a real chance to forge peace. People parted as the returning men led their horses to the stables or found places by the fires. The battered banners told the story. Umbers, Manderleys, Karstarks, Glovers, once scattered, now reunited under one cause. That evening, inside Winterfell's partially restored Great Hall, they prepared a feast of thanks. It was meager by pre-war standards, salt fish, turnips, some roast venison contributed by huntsmen, and a few barrels of ale, but the mood soared. Survivors of the Dreadfort infiltration recounted the final confrontation in half-boasts and half-horrified detail. Men toasted Hother Umber's savage courage, Jory Karstark's timely diversion, Wylus Manderly's steadfast leadership. They toasted Robb Stark most of all, calling him the young wolf reborn. Music drifted from a pair of fiddlers, though the hall's roof still had gaps patched with tarred cloth. Snow occasionally sifted in, glittering in the torchlight. Yet the spirit of the gathering was undeniable. House Stark had not only survived the Red Wedding but avenged it. Robb sat at the high table with Catelyn by his side, Grey Wind lying at his feet, calmly watching the festivities. He wore a fresh tunic embroidered with the Stark sigil. A cloth bandage on his arm itched beneath the sleeve, and bruises dappled his torso, but the pain receded in the warmth of camaraderie. He raised his cup of watered ale and, in a lull of the music, stood to address them all. The hall fell silent. "My friends," he began, "we have endured horrors few can fathom, betrayal, slaughter, the threat of tyranny by men who call themselves Northern Lords. Yet here we stand, battered but alive, free in our own lands. The Boltons are finished. The Freys stand alone across the neck, and the Lannisters brood in the south. But we have proven that the North will never bow to traitors or cowards. From this day forth, let all see that the dire wolf of Winterfell stands guard over our domain. No more flayed men, no more knives in the dark. We will rebuild. We will stand united as once we did, for the sake of every clan and house." A wave of cheers rose, a thunderous approval that reverberated off charred rafters. Robb bowed his head, eyes stinging with unshed tears. He thought of his father, Ned Stark, who had died for honor. He thought of the vassals who had bled for him at the Red Wedding, of the loyal ones cut down by crossbow bolts. Though he could never bring them back, he had paid their debt in part by ending the Boltons. With the North coalescing around him, maybe one day they would truly be safe. He resumed his seat. Catelyn leaned over, whispering, "Ned would be proud. I only wish we had reason to believe your sisters or brothers might be found." Pain flickered in her eyes, remembering the fragmentary rumors about Sansa or Arya. "But for now, let us carry on the legacy of House Stark with what we have." Robb nodded solemnly. "We can hope, and we can prepare the North for any future danger." He looked around at the men and women gathered. "We have a chance now, Mother. That's more than we had for a long while." She smiled, pressing his hand. They fell quiet, listening to the faint swirl of harp strings. Men poured each other more ale, telling tall tales, or weeping for lost friends. Some knights discussed traveling to the White Knife in spring to bring in new trade. Others boasted of retaking Moat Cailin from any squatters. Plans took shape, each one a glimmer of normalcy. As the night deepened, stars blinked through the torn patches of the roof, icy air drifting in. The feast wound down. Many found corners to sleep, drifting into exhausted slumber. Grey Wind dozed. Robb and Catelyn withdrew to a side chamber, an old solar partially repaired with tarps. A small brazier glowed. There, they quietly debriefed the final details. Then, after a time, his mother excused herself, leaving Robb alone with his thoughts. He stared at the flickering coals, hearing the faint echo of music from the hall. The North had survived near annihilation at the Twins, had endured the Boltons' cruelty, and now reclaimed both Winterfell and the Dreadfort. Felt like a chapter closed. And yet the realm still bristled with possibilities. An uncertain future with the Lannisters, the Freys, and any other storms beyond the horizon. Eventually, he rose, exhaustion winning. Grey Wind padded along as he sought his bedroll in a smaller side room that once might have been a steward's quarters. Nestling under furs, he shut his eyes. In the hush, he pictured a day when the snows would melt, farmland would be planted anew, and the North's scars would begin to heal. He envisioned the Great Hall fully restored, the children of the next generation running through Winterfell's corridors, never knowing the horrors inflicted by House Bolton. That dream gave him a fragile peace as he drifted off. Morning found him renewed enough to attend to the chores of governance. Over the following weeks, he and his loyal captains systematically reorganized northern defense. They dispatched letters to distant holds, urging each house to reaffirm fealty, to send word of any brigands, to coordinate shipments of grain. A sense of quiet purpose permeated Winterfell, broken only by the occasional rumor of Frey designs or Lannister edicts from King's Landing that threatened rebellious lords. None arrived with substance. Perhaps the Iron Throne realized the cost of subduing the North. Perhaps they were too embroiled in other wars. In any case, the North was left to its own devices. In time, more lords arrived for council: House Serwyn, House Tallheart, lesser branches of House Glover, a delegation from the mountain clans. They gawked at the battered state of Winterfell but expressed gratitude that the rightful line led them. Robb listened carefully to each concern, mindful of the mistakes he had made earlier in the war, determined not to alienate those who had sided with Bolton out of fear or necessity. He needed unity, not vengeance. The Great Council was set for early spring, if the roads cleared enough. By then, farmland might be sown, building on the promise of stability. Some nights, Robb still paced the courtyard, drifting under moonlight with gray wind. He would stand by the old charred stump in the godswood, pressing a hand to the scorched wood, remembering his father's face. The quiet flicker of the heart tree's regrowth hinted that even burned and battered things could live again. So too might House Stark. The path forward stretched wide. To maintain an independent North or negotiate uncertain treaties with the Crown, to rebuild or fortify. But at least now, with the Boltons gone, the choice belonged to the Starks themselves. He took small comfort in that knowledge, balancing his grief for lost siblings. Bran and Rickon presumably dead, Sansa and Arya fates unknown, against the satisfaction of seeing the North breathe free. War's shadows still clung to them, but within those shadows lay a core of hope. The land was scarred but alive, much like Robb himself. He had begun this war as a boy king, crowned amid the fervor of outraged bannermen. He had nearly been undone at the Twins, cut down by crossbow bolts. Yet fate or the old gods had willed him forward. Now, battered but unbowed, he guided the North's rebirth. Over time, the rumors of war with the Freys or the Lannisters might loom again. But for now, winter's hush gave them a respite. Men rebuilt, hunted, told tales by the hearth. Snow still fell, and the cold remained, but a new flame of unity glowed in the hearts of the northern folk. They spoke of the king in the north as if he had returned from death to avenge them, forging a legend from the actual horrors they had survived. Though Robb resisted such grand illusions, he saw the galvanizing effect it had on morale. Deep winter gave way to a faint promise of thaw, at least in patches. Streams trickled. Ravens flew more readily. The nights grew a fraction shorter. Catelyn arranged for storehouse renovations, ensuring no corner of the fortress was wasted. Wyman Manderley oversaw shipments of salted fish and bread from White Harbor, enough to feed the new garrisons at Winterfell and the Dreadfort. The scars of battle remained visible, the collapsed sections of ramparts, the blackened timbers of the Great Hall roof, but men labored daily to mend them. Morale soared with each day that passed free of Bolton tyranny. At last, the moment came when a fresh dawn revealed the wide courtyard cleared of snow by determined laborers, a sign that the Great Council would soon convene. Lords and captains trickled in, some on horseback, some with sleds. Umbers, Glovers, Tallhearts, Manderleys, Serwyns, mountain clans. Even a handful of free folk from beyond the Gift, rumors said, though that might be speculation. They gathered in the great hall, which had been partly roofed. The dais cleared, the floors repaired enough to hold a large assembly. Torches flamed on pillars, casting warm light. Banners of the dire wolf hung from the corners, tattered but proud. Robb and Catelyn presided at the dais, with Grey Wind lying watchful beside them. One by one, the lords offered oaths of loyalty or reaffirmed older pledges. Some demanded clarifications. What if King's Landing tried to reassert control? Robb answered with measured words, insisting the North would stand firm, forging alliances as needed, but refusing to kneel to those who had orchestrated or condoned the Red Wedding. The mood was one of cautious optimism. They would face the future as a united realm. In hushed corners, some speculated about marriage pacts, others about forging ties with the Vale or the Riverlands. All recognized the final authority of Robb Stark, king in the north. That evening, the hall turned to feasting once more. Musicians played old ballads. Lords mingled, voices echoing among the newly placed timbers overhead. Servants carried trays of steaming stew, warm bread, even some fresh-caught trout from the White Knife. In that glow, Robb felt an easing of the weight on his shoulders. The North, once fractured by betrayal, now found its center again. He sat with his mother, exchanging quiet words of reflection. Hother Umber and Wylus Manderly argued good-naturedly about which region produced the best archers. Jory Karstark discussed proposals for re-establishing trade routes. The older generation might recall better times before the wars, but at least now, the North had a chance to steer its own fate. When the music quieted, men raised a toast to the memory of Ned Stark, to the battered father who had planted seeds of honor in a land that needed them. Robb stood, lifting his cup. The hush deepened, and all eyes fixed on him. He felt the old pang of grief, but overcame it with gratitude. To my father, Eddard Stark, who taught us the meaning of justice, he said, may we carry his lessons forward. The wine burned his throat as he drank. The hall responded in kind. Ned Stark! Echoes soared to the rafters. Robb lowered his cup, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He had done what needed doing, ending Bolton, reclaiming the seat of his house, forging alliances. More trials lay ahead, no doubt, for the realm was never free of conflict. But in that moment, he sensed an unbreakable continuity between the old ways and the future he was forging. The North remembered, and under the direwolf banner, it had found renewed life. Later that night, with the crowd thinning and the torches guttering low, Robb took Grey Wind for one last walk around Winterfell's perimeter. The moon shone bright, silvering the half-rebuilt towers. Snow glittered on parapets. He paused at the scorched godswood, placing a hand on the charred stump that still sprouted faint green shoots. The hush of the night felt heavy with the presence of old gods, or at least the memory of them. He whispered a silent vow. No matter what storms the future brought, Frey vengeance, Lannister intrigue, Southern wars, House Stark would endure. He had seen the darkest betrayal and come out the other side, carrying the North's hopes on his shoulders. He would not falter. The battered realm had pinned its faith on him, and he would honor that faith. Grey Wind nudged him, ears alert to the shadows. Robb murmured, I know. It's time to rest. He turned back toward the keep, footsteps crunching softly. Beyond the battlements, the wide plains lay quiet, the distant silhouette of forests an inky line. Once, a young Robb Stark might have feared the future. Now, though scars remained, he had found his purpose. The night air tasted of pine and faint smoke, the scent of life persisting through winter's harsh rule. He crossed the yard, meeting a pair of sentries who bowed respectfully. One said, Good evening, Your Grace. A hint of awe in his tone. Robb nodded, no longer startled by such courtesy. Inside, the hall had mostly cleared. A few men dozed on benches, dreaming of better days. He climbed the worn steps to the repaired living quarters, where a small antechamber served as his room. Grey Wind curled near the hearth, flicking an ear. Robb set aside his sword belt, each movement a reminder of healing bruises. He cast a final glance out the narrow window, where pale stars shimmered above the wreckage of war. The future called. Closing his eyes, he settled on a pallet of furs. The cold stung his cheeks, but a warmth in his chest defied it. Perhaps someday, the North might truly know peace, and House Stark's children would run free among the green grasses of a reborn spring. The ghosts of the Red Wedding would fade, overshadowed by new laughter in these halls. And if further storms rose, they would face them as one. For the wolves of Winterfell had returned, tempered in flame and betrayal, yet unbroken. Their howls would echo across the frozen nights, a testament to the stubborn endurance of the North and its resolute king. Thus ended the war against House Bolton, and with that end, a battered realm began the slow climb back to hope. Robb Stark, the young wolf who had once been left for dead under crossbow bolts, now bore the burden and promise of a kingdom reclaimed. Though the scars ran deep, the dream of a strong, united North stood firm. In the moonlit hush of Winterfell, with gray winds gentle breathing the only sound, Robb felt the old gods watch over him. And in his heart he answered with quiet resolve. They would remember, they would rebuild, and never again would a red wedding shatter the wolf's reign. Robb Stark woke to gray winter light filling the repaired chamber, a faint gold radiance hinting at the day's promise. He pressed a hand to his bandaged side, wincing at the dull ache that ran beneath his ribs. Time had eased the worst of his wounds since the brutal campaign against House Bolton, but every injury left its mark. He was lucky enough that none would hamper him so severely as to prevent riding or wielding a blade. Yet the scars felt like physical reminders of the North's trials. He pushed aside the furs and rose stiffly, gray wind stirring at the foot of his pallet. The dire wolf opened one amber eye, then stretched, yawning wide. Already, in the corridor beyond, Robb heard the quiet bustle of new days in Winterfell. Servants carried logs to feed the hearths. Men spoke in hushed voices while stepping carefully over damaged flooring. Winter still laid thick snows outside the castle walls, but a sense of renewal flickered across the battered fortress. It had been weeks since Robb's return from the Dreadfort, and though the season remained cold, a subtle shift in daylight signaled the slow approach of spring. He dressed in sturdy breeches and a doublet embroidered with the direwolf sigil, then buckled on his sword belt more out of habit than immediate necessity. The war with House Bolton was over, but the North remained a land of uncertain loyalties. Some had pledged themselves wholeheartedly to him in the Great Council, while others hovered on the outskirts, watchful, wary that the Lannisters or Freys might strike. He refused to move about unarmed until the realm was firmly at peace. Even here, in the seat of his ancestors, vigilance was wise. He left his chambers and made his way along the corridor, gray wind padding at his side. Though the castle's renovations continued, many parts remained scorched or half-ruined. Sections of the roof in the Great Hall had been patched with new timbers, but the smell of burned wood lingered. Servants had begun hauling fresh straw to line the floors, in the hope that the wide drafts would not chill every bone. The tapestry hall was still a charred skeleton, its once grand hangings turned to ash in earlier wars. Slowly, methodically, Robb's men worked to rebuild everything that had been destroyed. In a small courtyard, he passed by a pair of carpenters smoothing a length of pine for new rafters. They glanced up and bowed stiffly, then returned to work. Robb paused a moment to watch them. Every hammer blow reminded him that the North's future demanded more than just swords. It needed farmers, builders, fishermen, tradesmen, all thriving under stable governance. His father had often told him that ruling was about protecting the small folk, not merely leading armies. Until recent weeks, war had consumed his every thought. Now, perhaps that war had abated enough for him to attempt rebuilding. He continued on, crossing a courtyard whose surface was a churn of half-frozen mud and snow. In earlier times, this courtyard had been used for archery practice or training. Now it was crowded with crates of materials, stacked timbers, and the occasional small group of men at arms. Among them, Jory Karstark spoke with a cluster of archers, pointing at newly erected targets near the far wall. Jory wore a thick cloak pinned with the Karstark Sunburst badge, and a bandage on his cheek hinted at a near miss in the final fight at the Dreadfort. Robb inclined his head in greeting. "Jory," he said, "has there been any word from your scouts?" Jory's breath frosted in the cold air as he replied, "Aye, your grace. They returned late last night. The roads south are mostly impassable from storms, though a few traders trickle in from the White Harbor route. No sign of Frey patrols on our side of the neck, at least not within striking distance. Seems Walder Frey's men are hunkered down behind their walls." Robb exhaled, letting tension seep away. "Good. We'll keep watch, though. The Freys may test us once the spring roads open." Jory nodded, then glanced at Grey Wind with guarded respect. The direwolf sniffed at a drifting patch of straw. "We've also had mention of some Riverlander travelers seeking refuge. They might arrive in a few days." Robb's brows arched. From the Riverlands? Are they outlaws, refugees, or envoys? Unknown, possibly small folk fleeing the chaos. We'll be ready to receive them. If they're harmless, we show them winter hospitality. If they're spies or brigands, we find out quickly enough. A faint smile touched Robb's face. Very well, carry on. He patted Jory's shoulder before moving on. The courtyard echoed with hammer strokes and low conversation. A group of newly recruited young men, bearing the sigil of lesser houses, practiced with wooden staves under an older soldier's instructions. Despite the harsh cold, they sweated, breath steaming. Robb remembered being that young himself, training under his father's watchful eye. But war had turned him older than his years. He quietly wished these recruits might be spared the worst experiences. He entered the partial warmth of the great hall, where the large hearth burned continually to keep the chill at bay. The space still looked ragged, beams blackened from old fires, draped cloths to block the open roof. Yet the gatherings held here in recent weeks had begun knitting the North together. Lords visited from near and far, forging alliances with House Stark anew. White Harbor men, Umbers, Glovers, even a few who had once feared Bolton retribution. They now cooperated, spurred by the king in the North's renewed authority. Toward the front of the hall, Caitlin waited, seated at a long table strewn with scrolls. She wore a heavy cloak trimmed with fur, her face still lined by the sorrow of old wounds but lit by a certain steely perseverance. She looked up as Robb approached. "Good morning," she said, smoothing a fold of parchment. "We've just received missives from White Harbor, Deepwood Mott, and House Serwyn." He settled beside her, resting a hand on the table. Gray wind lay at his feet. "Anything pressing?" Her eyes flicked over the documents. "Lord Wyman Manderley sends an update. More shipments of grain and salted fish are on the way when the thaw permits. Meanwhile, Lady Glover at Deepwood Mott is prepared to send a small force to help guard Moat Cailin if you wish. She's heard rumors that the Freys might attempt to retake the crossing by force. As for House Serwyn, they pledge men for your defense, if needed." Robb let out a slow breath of relief. It's heartening to see so many houses rally, a far cry from the fractures we had when the Boltons roamed unchecked. He scanned the Serwyn letter. "And the Glovers? They remain steadfast." "Yes," she confirmed. "They mention the Ironborn as a lingering threat on some coasts, but they're mostly repelled. They stand ready to back you." Nodding, Robb slid the letters aside. "We'll have to watch the coasts. The Ironborn have a habit of raiding in times of perceived weakness. For now, the priority is securing the neck. If Walder Frey remains behind his walls, let him. But I'll not have him creeping into our territory the moment the snow melts." Caitlin set down her parchment. "Do you plan to lead men south yourself, or dispatch a garrison? The roads might remain impassable for at least another moon's turn. Then there's the matter of the King's Landing situation. We have no word yet on whether the Lannisters plan a northern campaign in the spring. They might have pressing concerns in the south, but we cannot be certain." Robb's expression darkened slightly, remembering the name Lannister. "One enemy at a time. I'll likely fortify Moat Cailin with a loyal force. Hother Umber or Jory Karstark could command it. I might remain here for a while longer, solidifying Winterfell's defenses. Then we'll see if the Freys attempt anything rash. If they do, we'll meet them." She nodded, weary but resolute. "Very well. I'll organize the letters. Lord Wyman wants to send delegates once the roads open. Possibly Lady Glover will do the same. We might expect a small convocation here in early spring. Then you can unify the North's next steps." He clasped her hand briefly. "Thank you. Without you, I'd be overwhelmed." A small smile curved her lips, though sadness lingered in her eyes. "We do what we must for the North, and for your father's memory." He rose, hand tingling from her warmth. "Yes, Father would want us to stand together, especially now that House Bolton is gone. We'll keep forging ahead." Gray wind stood as Robb left the table, trotting in his wake. Outside, a swirl of brisk wind ruffled cloaks. Robb made his way to the stables, where he found a handful of Manderley knights saddling horses. They bowed as he approached, greeting him cheerfully. He recognized Ser Marlon Manderley among them, the nephew of Lord Wyman, who had fought alongside him at Winterfell. "Your Grace," Ser Marlon said, brushing straw from his gloves, "we plan to scout the outskirts, see how the farmland fares. Rumor has it a few villages closer to the Shivering Forest might have furs or other goods to trade." Robb inclined his head. "Carry on, but keep an eye for bandits. Some men displaced by the war roam about. Report back anything unusual." They nodded, leading their horses out into the swirl of snow. Robb lingered in the stable yard, noticing that the stablemaster had acquired 2 new broodmares. Despite the war, life pushed forward. Horses needed breeding, fields needed sowing. Perhaps, in a year or so, the North might see fresh harvest if the gods granted a gentler summer. His heart twinged with a pang of regret, recalling the many dead from the Red Wedding, from the battles against Bolton. Could he truly mend the wounds that scarred his homeland? He remembered carrying his father's legacy, the vow never to forget the small folk. Ruling the North was more than retribution. It was about forging a future beyond the cruelty of House Bolton and the cunning tyranny of the Freys. If the Lannisters eventually marched, the North needed unity and resilience. He returned to the keep, drifting through hallways where battered tapestries had been replaced by simple cloth banners bearing the direwolf. A guard bowed him into a small council chamber, where Wylis Manderley, Hother Umber, and Gavin Glover awaited. They'd asked for a meeting to discuss a new matter that had arisen. Robb shut the door behind him, gray wind settling by the threshold. Hother Umber, the big man still sporting a sling for a shoulder wound, let out a booming greeting. "Robb, we've got some news from the west, near the rills. My men found signs that a party of armed travelers passed through, likely heading deeper into the interior. They carried no obvious banner, but some small folk said they wore pale gray cloaks with no sigil. Possibly Sellswords." Wylis Manderley folded his hands. Sellswords might be scouting for the Freys or the Lannisters, or they might be rogues, but it's suspicious. They avoided contact with local villages. Gavin Glover's grim expression suggested worry. "We could dispatch riders to track them, but the terrain is harsh. If they mean sabotage, it's best we know before they vanish." Robb listened, fingers drumming lightly on the table. "How many were there?" "From the footprints, perhaps a dozen," Hother Umber replied. "No wagons. They traveled light. The small folk said they paid with silver stags, southern coin. That suggests a link to the crown or a wealthy sponsor." Robb weighed the possibilities. It could be a Lannister envoy, or men sent by Walder Frey in secret, or even some other faction. This realm is open to infiltration, especially after so much turmoil. Let's not ignore them. We can't allow unknown armed groups to roam freely. Wylis nodded. "Agreed. Should we send a detachment of riders or footmen?" Robb considered. "Yes, but not too large. We want speed and stealth. We'll instruct them to question these travelers peacefully if possible, or apprehend them if they resist. If they vanish, so be it, but at least we'll have tried." "Hother, can your men handle that?" The Umber Lord grunted in the affirmative. "I'll pick a squad of sturdy folk who know the back roads. We'll see what these strangers are about." Thus concluded the meeting, with the quiet agreement that secrecy and vigilance were paramount. The North was newly cleansed of Bolton tyranny, but new threats could sprout. Robb parted ways with the men, instructing them to keep him informed. That night, the wind howled around the ramparts, driving fresh snowdrifts across the courtyard. Robb paced the walls, remembering the dreadful siege that had in them here only moons ago. The shattered sections of the ramparts were mostly repaired, though the stone was mismatched in places. Torches sputtered in iron brackets, illuminating a swirl of white flakes. Guards in stark livery marched their rounds, bows in hand. Gray wind followed Robb's every step. The dire wolf sometimes lifted his head to sniff the air. In the distance, beyond Winterfell's walls, lay the wide darkness of the North. So many villages had been scarred by war, so many fields left fallow. His father's voice echoed in memory. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Indeed, Robb had ended Roose Bolton's life with his own blade. But it would take years to banish the legacy of fear the Boltons had sown. Another voice inside him demanded that he show the realm how Stark could offer stability and justice, not just vengeance. He resolved to keep forging new alliances, to treat uncertain vassals with fairness, and to keep the nightmares of the Red Wedding from poisoning the realm's future. The next morning broke with clearing skies, though temperatures remained bitter. Robb convened a small audience in the Great Hall to address local disputes. He recognized that the war had disrupted everything from livestock ownership to marriage pacts. This was the daily work of a ruler, less dramatic than battles but vital. A line of petitioners formed, peasants and minor lords, each with a small claim or plea. One old farmer insisted a neighbor had stolen his goats while the farmer fled the Boltons. The neighbor contested, claiming he'd been asked to watch them. Robb listened to both sides, glancing occasionally at Catelyn and Wylis Manderly for their input. In the end, he judged that half the goats be returned, plus a share of next season's offspring. A simple, balanced solution. That small matter might mean far more to those peasants than any high-level war council. A minor dispute over foraging rights in the nearby forest followed. Two families insisted they had the right to gather deadwood there. Robb assigned them specific patches of the forest, ensuring both had access. He recalled how Ned Stark handled such issues with calm and empathy, bridging the gap between the small folk. Each resolution felt like a quiet victory for peace, though not all left fully satisfied. As the day wore on, more serious matters arose. A merchant complained that bandits roamed the roads near a half-ruined watchtower once manned by Bolton men. Another elder spoke tearfully of a kinsman tortured by the Boltons, now broken in mind and spirit. She asked for help, though the situation was beyond direct mending. Robb offered to let them remain within Winterfell's safer walls, or find them a place in a loyal holdfast. He forced himself to remain steady, concealing the old anger that flared whenever the Boltons' atrocities were recounted. They had done so much damage. Their house name now ended in blood, but the wounds endured. Late in the afternoon, the audience concluded. Robb rubbed his temples, exhausted by the swirl of troubles. Catelyn guided him to a side table, where a simple meal of bread, onions, and stew had been laid. She poured him watered ale. "You do well," she murmured, glancing at him with concern. "But you must pace yourself. We can't solve everything in a day." He managed a lopsided smile. "Father always made it look easy. I wonder if he carried this same weight every hour." She placed a hand over his. "He did. But he had your mother to share some burdens. Now you have me, and others who believe in you. Don't forget that." He squeezed her hand, grateful. Gray wind sniffed around the table, looking for scraps, but she gently shooed the dire wolf away. The old gods knew the wolf had gorged on enough scraps from the store. After finishing the modest meal, Robb decided to inspect the training yard. There, a group of younger knights sparred under the watch of an older master-at-arms. Their wooden swords clattered. One young man slipped on packed snow, cursing as he fell. Another laughed until the master barked at him to focus. Robb stepped to the edge of the yard, nodding to the instructor, who gave a short bow in acknowledgement. The sight of these novices brought a faint ache to Robb's heart. He'd once been a novice himself, learning from Roderick Castle, practicing with Jon Snow and Theon Greyjoy in the yard. Where were they now? Theon had betrayed him, seizing Winterfell under Ironborn orders. The young man he'd once called a friend was either vanished or imprisoned by the Boltons, if rumors were to be believed. As for Jon, last Robb heard, he had joined the Night's Watch, embroiled in an entirely different war beyond the Wall. There was no telling what might have become of him. The realm was so large, and each life had branched away. "You, lad," Robb said suddenly, calling to one of the novices who had shown good footwork. "Watch your right side. You were open for a strike." The young man, no older than 15, blinked wide eyes at seeing the king in the north himself. "Why, yes, your grace," he stammered, fumbling with his practiced sword. Robb nodded in encouragement. "Keep your guard up. Quick feet. You'll do well." He turned away, letting them return to training. That snippet of guidance reminded him that even if the realm was battered, it could produce new generations who might know less war. Perhaps these novices could spend more time learning the arts of peace. A faint hope, but one that made him press on. Days blurred into a routine of governance, training, and vigilance. Letters arrived from various corners of the north, each bringing news of slow recovery or local disputes. White Harbor's shipments continued trickling in. The men at Moat Cailin reported no sign of Frey encroachment. House Glover sent word of a mild scuffle with stray Ironborn, quickly repelled. Hother Umber's scouts, dispatched to track the mysterious travelers in the west, returned with the report that the group had vanished near a series of abandoned farmsteads. No clear leads emerged. Possibly they had turned south or found some hidden route through the hills. A half-moon cycle later, as the north settled further, the time for forging outward ties arrived. The Great Council had determined that alliances with the Riverlands might be beneficial. The Tully name once carried weight, though Edmure Tully was presumably a captive of the Freys or the Lannisters. Riverland lords might be seeking a champion against Frey tyranny. If Robb could re-establish contact with them, perhaps they could unify the region. This approach carried risk, since Walder Frey effectively blocked the main crossing into the Riverlands. But smaller paths or secret routes might circumvent that barrier. One cold morning, Robb sat with Caitlin, Wylus Manderley, and a few other advisors in a tower chamber made into a strategy room. Maps of the Riverlands lay unfurled on a table, weighted with stones. Caitlin pointed to the twins, the strategic crossing of the Green Fork which the Freys held. "Should we attempt direct negotiations with Walder Frey?" she asked, a note of distaste in her voice. "Or do we try to slip around him, connecting with the Blackwood or Mallister lands near Seaguard?" Wylus frowned. "Negotiations with that butcher? After the Red Wedding, it seems an insult to speak with him at all." Robb's expression hardened. "I see no point in negotiations. Walder Frey would demand terms I'd never accept. He'd likely attempt more treachery if he could. I'd rather starve him of advantage, show him we are not so easily trapped again." Caitlin nodded, lines of grief on her brow. "Then we consider alternative routes. The Mallisters at Seaguard might welcome your cause, especially if they resent the Freys. But reaching Seaguard by land is difficult. By sea, perhaps, White Harbor ships could sail around the Bight and south. That's an option, but winter seas are perilous." Wylus tapped the map near Seaguard. "We do have some ships. If we wait for the worst storms to pass, it might be feasible. We might land near Seaguard or the Cape of Eagles, then travel inland to rally any Riverlanders. But do we truly need an alliance with them right now?" Robb leaned back. "If we remain isolated, the Freys hold the crossing. They could attempt to encroach on our borders. Or the Lannisters might strike from the west via the sea if they ally with the Ironborn. Better to preempt that by building a mutual defense. Also, if we can retrieve my uncle Edmure Tully, who I believe is a prisoner in the Twins or near Riverrun, we might strengthen the Tully name in the Riverlands." Caitlin's mouth tightened. "Edmure, he was forced to watch as the Freys took Riverrun. If we could free him or restore Tully rule somehow, that would bring hope to the Riverlands." She paused, wincing at the memory of her father's seat. "But it's a dangerous mission. Walder Frey has more men than we can easily handle, and the crossing is formidable. If we fail, we lose more men." Robb considered the risk. "We might not mount a large-scale incursion yet. A small diplomatic party by sea might suffice, traveling to Seaguard to speak with Lord Jason Mallister in secret. If he's receptive, we build from there. It might open a path to approach Riverrun from an unexpected angle. If Edmure is still alive, we find a way to free him." Silence reigned as they weighed the plan. Wylus shrugged. "Though risky, it might pay dividends. The Freys expect any approach via the Twins, not the coastline." Caitlin exhaled. "Then so be it. But who will lead such a mission?" Her tone carried a hint of protective concern. "You, Robb? Or do you send an envoy? Robb tapped the table absently. He didn't relish leaving Winterfell so soon after securing it. The realm needed him here. On the other hand, if the mission was crucial, his presence might be necessary to ensure success. I might not go myself, at least not yet. The men need me to hold the North Stable. Perhaps I dispatch a trusted envoy, someone with enough standing to be taken seriously. Jory Karstark or even Wylis could lead. Or perhaps my mother. Catelyn's brows rose. Me? He nodded slowly. You're a Tully by birth. Mallister men respect your family. You know the Riverlands better than any of us. If anyone could persuade them to join our cause or at least open talks, it's you. And Walder Frey hates you personally, which might hamper negotiations if you tried to approach the twins. But we're not dealing with Walder directly. She pressed her lips together, torn. It's been so long since I traveled those lands, and the sea route is dangerous. But if it could help free Edmure or rally the Riverlands, yes, I'll do it if that is your will. Robb placed a hand on hers, bracing. I won't force you, Mother. This war has cost you so much. But you might be our best hope to secure a foothold in the Riverlands. She drew a breath, eyes flickering with memories of old journeys along the Red Fork and the Tumblestone. Then I'll go. Let me assemble a small retinue. We'll take a White Harbor vessel once the weather allows, sail to Seaguard, attempt to meet Jason Mallister. If the gods favor us, we'll find allies there. Wylis Manderly nodded. I'll provide a ship from White Harbor, something swift that can handle winter seas. My father's name should help secure docking. We'll keep the mission discreet. Robb exhaled. It's settled, then. Gather what you need. The roads to White Harbor might be passable in a fortnight or so, depending on storms. We aim for an early spring departure. They concluded the discussion on that note, tension mingling with hope. Robb could see the worry in Catelyn's eyes, but also the flicker of determination. She had lost so much. Her father, her husband, the illusions of a peaceful life. But here she was, ready to hazard a dangerous voyage to restore some measure of Tully influence. In the days that followed, the plan took shape. Catelyn selected a retinue of about 20 men. A mix of Manderly knights, Karstark archers, and a few discreet courtiers. She insisted on minimal fanfare. They would slip quietly to White Harbor, then board a single ship, hugging the coast if weather permitted, making for Seaguard. The actual departure awaited the road's clearing. Meanwhile, life in Winterfell carried on with repairs, rationing, training, and an undercurrent of restless energy. People looked to the future, some with optimism, others with wariness. One wind-scoured morning, a new party of travelers arrived at Winterfell's gates. The watchers signaled that they carried no overt sigils but seemed peaceful. Robb and a handful of guards greeted them in the courtyard, finding a small band of Riverlanders, 3 men, 2 women, and a child, half frozen, leading a donkey laden with supplies. They looked battered by the road, cloaks patched, boots crusted with ice. The eldest man, stooped and white-haired, bowed awkwardly. "We come seeking the king in the north," he said, voice shaking from cold and age. "We're from a hamlet near Fairmarket. Fled to the hills when the Freys demanded new taxes. Heard rumors your realm offers refuge." Robb studied them with compassion. "We do. If you come peacefully, you may stay. But the journey is perilous. Why risk it?" The man's eyes flashed with a hint of desperation. "The Freys tightened their grip, my lord, my king. Anyone who spoke ill of them was whipped or thrown in cells. We had nothing left. Some said Robb Stark lived, that the north was free of the Boltons. We had to see if that was true." Robb nodded. "Then welcome. We'll find you shelter. In time, if you wish to return to your home, we may help. For now, rest." He assigned them to a small corner of the keep, offering warm stew and straw mats. Another trickle of refugees from the south, each new arrival confirming that Walder Frey's harsh rule had not eased. If anything, the old man might be tightening his hold, fearing the North's resurgence. Rumors also drifted that the Freys were fracturing internally, with rival heirs vying for favor. Walder Frey was ancient. Some believed that if he died, the house might collapse into infighting, giving the Riverlands a chance to break free. But such hopes were uncertain. Frey cunning ran deep, and the Crown still recognized them as wardens of the crossing, or so they claimed. Each passing day, the roads slowly improved. As the thickest snows receded, wagons from White Harbor arrived more reliably. The moats and streams began to unfreeze. Hunts brought in the occasional deer, augmenting the store of salted fish. The battered orchard near Winterfell even showed signs of tiny buds on the skeletal branches, hinting that spring might truly come. Men spoke of traveling roads that had been closed for months. They carried letters across the realm, forging new lines of communication. Finally, the day approached for Catelyn's departure. Her retinue gathered in the courtyard, the horses fitted with gear for a journey to White Harbor. She wore a cloak of deep gray trimmed in fox fur, a Tully fish pin fastened at her breast, a subtle reminder of her lineage. Ser Marlon Manderly was among the escort, as was a Karstark knight named Ser Rodwell, both sworn to see her safely to White Harbor and then onto the ship. Robb joined them by the stables, his breath visible in the brisk air. He clasped Catelyn's hand and took a moment to meet her eyes. "I wish I could go with you," he said, "but the North needs its king here, or so they keep reminding me." She smiled thinly, sadness in that expression. "We'll see each other again soon, I hope. My heart remains uneasy leaving you here. But if forging alliances in the Riverlands can help us reclaim Tully's strength, I must try." He bowed his head, pressing his forehead briefly to hers. "Take care, mother. The seas are treacherous, and so are the Freys. Trust only in our allies. If you meet Lord Mallister, be wary of spies in his halls. We cannot know if the Lannisters or Freys have infiltrated." She squeezed his hand, then mounted her horse with practiced grace. "I'll remember, my son. The old gods be with you until I return." He stepped back, allowing her retinue to form up. The gatehouse opened. With a swirl of horses' hooves on hard-packed snow, they rode out, banners snapping lightly in the breeze. Robb watched them vanish into the pale horizon, a pang of worry lodging in his chest. Gray Wind let out a low whine, as if sensing his mixed emotions. Time marched on after Catelyn's departure. Robb threw himself into the tasks of the realm, convening daily councils with Wylis Manderly, Hother Umber, Gavin Glover, and Jory Karstark. The seeds for a new administrative structure were planted. He appointed watchers for the roads, stewards for the farmland, and men to keep an eye on banditry. Letters from lords scattered across the north arrived, reaffirming fealty or seeking guidance. Even the mountain clans of the west, typically independent, sent a small delegation to discuss trade of furs and ore for grain. Robb welcomed them, seeing the possibilities of a robust northern economy that might hold up better against any southern threat. He also considered the fates of Moat Cailin and the Dreadfort, both now garrisoned by loyal men, though the Dreadfort's sinister legacy lingered. Some, including Hother Umber, had suggested razing it entirely, so no one would ever harness House Bolton's seat again. Others advised maintaining it as a strategic vantage against any threat from the east. Robb settled on a middle course. Keep a small garrison, but dismantle the dungeons and flaying halls, removing all signs of Bolton cruelty. The fortress would be a bleak outpost, never again a seat of power. Meanwhile, short dispatches arrived from White Harbor describing Catelyn's progress. She had reached the port safely, meeting Lord Wyman Manderly, who was apparently robust in spirit despite the hardships of the war. He had equipped a ship, the Pearl of the Bight, for the voyage south. She would sail soon, weather permitting. Robb read these letters with relief, then prayed the seas would remain calm enough for her crossing. The next steps would be more dangerous. Eventually, news from White Harbor ceased as she embarked on her voyage. Robb had to trust her skill and the good sense of her escort. In the hush of nights, he often found himself walking the halls of Winterfell alone, or pacing the Godswood with Gray Wind. He'd rest a hand on the charred stump of the heart tree, letting old memories swirl. He recalled a time when his father, mother, siblings, and Theon had dined happily in the Great Hall, unburdened by betrayal. Now, so much had changed, yet the essence of House Stark's honor endured. He owed it to them, to his father's memory, to shape a future that honored that tradition. An early spring brought muddy roads and cold rains that battered the castle roofs. Carpenters hurried to patch new leaks. The orchard trees showed faint buds of green. A sense of momentum built. Men began clearing farmland, scattering seeds even though the ground remained partially frozen in places. The North had to produce its own harvest to avoid dependency on White Harbor's shipments. Wagons traveling from the west reported that a few scattered Ironborn still prowled the coast, but that local lords managed to fend them off. One evening, while huddled in the solar with Jory Karstark and Wylis Manderly, Robb received a startling messenger. A young boy from a distant hamlet who had run day and night to reach Winterfell, carrying a half-burned parchment with a scrawled note. The note claimed that a small band of Frey riders had been spotted near the Salt Spear, possibly testing the boundary of the neck. They wore no open sigils, but had been identified by their speech and a minor banner glimpsed. The local folk feared this was the prelude to a larger intrusion. Wylis swore, "They test us already. With the roads thawing, the Freys might see if we're vulnerable." Robb's jaw clenched. "We'll respond. Send a strong detachment to scour the area. If these Frey riders are found, we'll demand to know their purpose. If they resist, drive them out or capture them. Walder Frey will learn that we do not lie idle." Jory volunteered to lead the operation, but Robb decided to dispatch a more experienced field commander, perhaps Glover men with a few Karstarks. Jory already had duties at Winterfell, and Glover men were closer to that region. They settled on a mixed force of 50 riders, lightly equipped, led by a seasoned knight named Ser Lancel Glover. At dawn the next day, they galloped out under gray skies, seeking any sign of Frey infiltration. As always, waiting weighed heavily on Robb. He spent the next few days pacing the ramparts, listening for word. Then, as drizzle slicked the stones, he heard horns at the gate. The riders returned, spattered with mud, victorious in their bearing. Lancel Glover delivered his report in the courtyard with onlookers gathered. He described how they tracked the Frey party to a small cluster of abandoned huts near a stream. The Freys claimed they were simply scouting roads, but refused to yield or show any letter of safe passage. A brief skirmish erupted, and the Freys fled. 2 were taken prisoner, the rest escaped south. Robb ordered the prisoners brought forth. The men, wearing mismatched cloaks, scowled defiantly. Under questioning, they admitted serving House Frey, though they insisted they had no ill intent, only collecting taxes from possible holdouts. The idea that the Freys demanded taxes in Northern Territory was outrageous. Robb's rage simmered. He recognized that Walder Frey might try to push lines if no one resisted. Letting them slip by would embolden them. He questioned the prisoners personally in a small tower chamber. One admitted that they'd been tasked by Ryman Frey, one of Walder's brood, to assess how strong the North was, to see if the Bolton fiasco had left House Stark weakened. The other prisoner spat curses, refusing to speak beyond that. Robb considered their fates. Northern custom demanded harsh responses to trespassers and spies, especially from a hostile house. Yet his father's lessons about measured justice rang in his mind. Summarily executing them might be the expected route, but he saw an opportunity. These men could carry a message back to the Freys if used carefully. In the end, he told them, "You have trespassed on northern soil under false pretenses. My father's law would name you oathbreakers, subject to the sword. But I'll offer mercy if you carry my warning to Walder Frey. Any further trespass shall not be forgiven. The North stands united. If he truly wants war, let him come openly. Otherwise, stay south of the neck." He had them sign a confession of wrongdoing, inasmuch as they could write or mark. Then he released them with the condition they ride straight back to the twins. One prisoner sullenly refused to sign, so Robb declared that man an outlaw, to remain imprisoned or face the block. The other, trembling with relief at the chance to survive, accepted. In the courtyard, a hush fell as Robb told the watchers, "These Freys carry my message. Let them pass. If we see them again in our lands, they forfeit their lives." Thus, the Frey infiltration ended. It remained to be seen how Walder Frey would respond. If he seethed for vengeance, that was nothing new. Robb's stance was clear. They would not be lulled into complacency. The affair hardened the men's resolve, reminding them that the war's embers still burned. The watchers at Moat Cailin doubled in vigilance. In small gatherings, men debated whether the Freys might attempt a full invasion come summer. Yet the North was stronger now, better prepared. Any such invasion would meet a formidable defense. Meanwhile, Robb's thoughts turned often to Caitlin. He had no fresh letters from her, as the sea route made ravens unreliable. He could only assume she'd reached Seaguard or made contact with House Mallister. The tension sometimes kept him awake into the small hours, wandering corridors with gray wind. At times, he visited the library tower, rummaging through half-burned tomes that survived. He found genealogical records, old accounts of trade with the Vale, scraps of family histories. The sense of continuity comforted him. For thousands of years, House Stark had endured. They would not fail now. Spring advanced in fits and starts, with occasional flurries swirling among the raindrops. The farmland around Winterfell turned muddy, but seeds went into the ground, hopes sprouting for the coming harvest. More travelers arrived from the south, mostly refugees or small merchants, trickling through the neck on hidden trails. Some told tales of Riverlanders chafing under Frey rule, of bandits running wild near the Trident. They whispered that Riverrun lay half-deserted, Edmure Tully locked away, and Walder Frey devoting more attention to securing the area around the twins. Possibly the old man recognized that a direct confrontation with the North would not be simple. A stirring of excitement gripped Winterfell when, at long last, a battered White Harbor ship sailed up the White Knife, carrying a small group from the Riverlands. They disembarked near a riverside holdfast and journeyed north on horseback. Word reached Robb that their leader was a knight named Ser Aemon Mallister, cousin to Lord Jason Mallister of Seaguard. With him were half a dozen men plus 2 cloaked figures. They were rumored to have arrived in answer to some private summons. Robb quickly surmised that Caitlyn's mission had borne fruit. Possibly she had succeeded in forging an alliance or convincing the Mallisters to send an envoy. When the party approached Winterfell's gates, the Watchers blew horns. Robb, accompanied by Wylis Manderly and Jory Karstark, greeted them in the courtyard. Ser Aemon Mallister was a lean man with streaks of gray in his hair, wearing the Mallister eagle device on his cloak. He bowed properly. "Your Grace, I bring greetings from Lord Jason Mallister of Seaguard. I also bring tidings from your lady mother." Robb's pulse quickened. "My mother? Where is she? Is she well?" Ser Aemon smiled, lines of fatigue around his eyes. "She remains at Seaguard in good health, forging the beginnings of an alliance with House Mallister and certain other riverlords who resent the Freys. I come to speak with you about next steps to see if we might coordinate. She bade me deliver this." He produced a sealed letter, stamped with the Tully fish. Robb took it gingerly, relief flooding him. He beckoned the envoy inside, leading them to the warmth of the great hall. There, over cups of ale, he read Caitlyn's letter. Her handwriting conveyed cautious optimism. She had arrived safely, found Lord Jason Mallister open to discussion. He detested Walder Frey. He believed many smaller Riverland houses quietly yearned for an alliance with the Starks. However, the Freys kept a stranglehold on the main crossing, and Riverrun remained out of loyal Tully hands. She hinted at a plan to rally scattered riverlords in a clandestine meeting at Seaguard in a few months, possibly culminating in joint action to free Edmure Tully. But everything depended on timing and on the North's willingness to commit help. Robb pressed the letter to his chest, feeling pride in his mother's success. Then he turned to Ser Aemon. "Tell me more. Do the Mallisters truly stand ready to defy the Freys openly?" Ser Aemon nodded, taking a careful sip of ale. "Indeed, my lord. We have skirmished with Frey patrols near the coast, and we loathe their tyranny. My cousin Jason seeks to gather any riverlords unshackled by Walder's threats. The Dairies, perhaps the Blackwoods, maybe others, though they must tread carefully. With your mother's presence, we gained confidence. She carried word of House Stark's strength, your defeat of the Boltons. That impressed the lords. They see you as a symbol that betrayal can be overcome. Robb's gaze swept the room, taking in Wylus Manderly, Jory Karstark, and the few northern lords present. This is an opportunity to isolate Walder Frey. If the Riverlands rises against him, we might strangle his power at the Twins. But we must weigh the cost. The North cannot easily launch a massive campaign south. We have our own rebuilding. Ser Aemon inclined his head. Lord Jason does not ask for a grand invasion, only that you stand ready to coordinate, to apply pressure at Moat Cailin if the Freys try to muster an army. If you can keep them pinned from the north, the Riverlords might reclaim Riverrun or at least rescue Lord Edmure. Then, if the lines shift, a joint campaign might reduce Walder's hold altogether. Robb's heart pounded. The notion of freeing Edmure Tully and restoring Riverland autonomy stirred him, both for family loyalty and strategic gain. "I'd be a fool to ignore the chance," he murmured. "We are not yet strong enough for a full war, but we can harass the Freys if they move north. That might be enough. Meanwhile, if the Riverlands handle the crossing from the south, Walder Frey's seat could be threatened." He read on, gleaning that Catelyn planned to remain in Seaguard for a while, furthering negotiations. In the letter's final lines, she expressed a mother's longing to see him again, urging caution but also hope. His eyes warmed at that personal note. Then he turned to the rest. "We must proceed carefully. The Freys are cunning, and if they sense a combined rebellion, they might call on the crown. The Lannisters could intervene in the Riverlands with a large force. That would drag us into a new war, which we are not fully prepared for. But if we do nothing, we leave my uncle Edmure languishing in captivity, and we allow Walder Frey to threaten our borders. The best path is measured cooperation with the Mallisters. We'll remain watchful for any Lannister movement." Wylus Manderly spoke. "White Harbor can lend ships if the Mallisters need naval support along the coast. But it would be small. We cannot lose control of our port. We rely on trade." Jory Karstark offered, "We can supply a token force to the southwestern edges, near the neck. Just enough to show presence if the Freys come. But no grand host. That might keep the Freys pinned." Robb agreed, turning back to Ser Aemon. "Convey to Lord Jason that we stand as allies in principle. We will coordinate a watch at the neck. If the Freys muster, we'll hamper them. If the Riverlords can unify, we will consider further steps. My mother remains with you to refine the details, and we trust her judgment. Is that acceptable?" Ser Aemon nodded, relief in his features. "I believe it is. The Riverlands have yearned for a champion since the Tully fall. Many speak your name with admiration. Though the Red Wedding cast doubt, your survival and triumph over Bolton are legendary. They call you the Young Wolf Reborn." Robb suppressed a grimace at such a title. He had no taste for hero worship. Yet if that legend aided the cause, so be it. Then let us build on that. Remain a week as my guest. Rest from your travels. We'll draft letters for you to carry back to Lord Mallister. Then we see how events unfold. That night, a modest feast welcomed Ser Aemon's party. The great hall was still no grand spectacle. The roof had been patched more thoroughly, but drafts continued. The seating was plain benches and tables, and the meal relied heavily on fish and root vegetables. Yet the mood was bright enough. The men drank, told stories. Hother Umber boasted about the battles at Winterfell. Wylus Manderly recounted how they had shattered Bolton's lines. Ser Aemon listened with wide-eyed respect. In a quieter moment, Robb pulled Ser Aemon aside, curious about developments in King's Landing. Aemon had little direct knowledge, but rumored that the Lannisters fought among themselves, with Cersei struggling to maintain power. Stannis Baratheon might still stand at the wall, or might have turned to other conflicts. The realm was fractious, and that fractiousness might buy the North time. "Nothing is certain," Ser Aemon said, "but I hear no rumor of an immediate Lannister march on the north. They have too many fires to stamp out." Robb filed this away. Each rumor shifted possibilities. He realized how precarious everything remained. One major shift in the south could send armies rolling north. House Stark needed alliances, but also caution, to avoid another calamity. The days passed swiftly while Ser Aemon recovered from the journey. Robb drafted letters to his mother, to Jason Mallister, to any riverlords who might read them. He pledged moral support, a willingness to coordinate, but stressed the North's need to rebuild. He asked for secrecy, encouraging the riverlords to keep the Freys unaware. Meanwhile, he quietly mobilized a moderate force near Moat Cailin. 200 men from the Umbers, Glovers, and Manderleys, commanded by a trusted knight, to watch for southern incursions. If Walder Frey tried to slip an army north, that vantage point could slow or halt them. At last, Ser Aemon departed, carrying Robb's letters. He assured them he would sail from White Harbor and return to Seaguard. If all went well, they would coordinate a more formal alliance within a few months. As the snows receded further, the north came alive with travel. Merchants braved the roads, peasants ventured out to sow fields, and minor lords arrived at Winterfell to pay respects. Though the fortress remained under repair, the Great Hall once again served as a seat of governance, thrumming with echoes of older times. Robb found himself presiding over disputes, forging trade pacts for timber, ensuring that no pockets of Bolton loyalists remained. The more he immersed himself in the daily rhythms of rule, the more he appreciated the burdens Ned Stark had carried so gracefully. He also discovered an unexpected solace in the occasional laughter or triumph of the small folk. When an orphan boy from a burned village was reunited with a lost sister, or when a new orchard planting found success, Robb felt a spark of joy. These little victories offset the gloom that war had inflicted. The North was battered, but not broken. The hope that had seemed impossible in the wake of the Red Wedding glimmered anew. One afternoon, as he walked near the castle's outer walls, a raven arrived bearing a letter sealed with a fish and eagle crest, the combined symbols of Tully and Mallister. With a leap of excitement, Robb recognized his mother's handwriting inside. The letter described progress in Seaguard, how Lord Mallister had convened a covert meeting of local riverlords. House Blackwood, House Derry, even a representative from the remnants of House Bracken. All expressed discontent with Frey dominion. None dared openly rebel yet, but talk of an alliance grew serious. She believed that if they could confirm Edmure Tully was alive and rescue him, many would rise. They were discussing possible infiltration near Riverrun's area, though details remained fluid. Robb read each line twice, relief mingling with concern for her safety. She ended the letter by stating she might remain for several more moons. If events moved quickly, she would send word. If not, she urged him not to worry. In the margin, she had written a small personal note. "I miss you, my son. You lead well. Keep the North strong. I do this for Father, for all we lost, for what might yet be regained." Clutching that letter, Robb felt a potent mix of gratitude and longing. He had no illusions that these negotiations were anything but perilous. Walder Frey still held powerful positions. A misstep could lead to fresh bloodshed. But if his mother believed in the cause, so would he. He penned a reply, pledging continued vigilance, describing the freed infiltration repelled at Moat Cailin, the reinforcements across the realm. He sealed it, pressing the direwolf signet into warm wax. Another raven soared south. Weeks passed in a hum of rebuilding. Under the clearing sky, farmland spread with the first green shoots. People began talking about a new harvest that might arrive by late summer if the gods were kind. White Harbor's trade picked up, bringing fish, salt, and textiles to feed and clothe Winterfell. Moat Cailin watchers reported no fresh Frey movements. The nights grew warmer, so men slept less fitfully in the battered corridors. Robb oversaw expansions in the stable, ensuring more horses for patrols. Each small step represented progress, yet tension never fully abated. Everyone remembered how quickly the realm had turned bloody before. The ghost of betrayal still lingered. When men sang in the hall at night, songs about the young wolf's cunning or House Stark's enduring legacy, Robb felt uneasy, as though these ballads polished away the raw horror of the Red Wedding. He let them sing for morale's sake, but he refused to indulge in illusions of invincibility. War could return in a heartbeat. One starlit evening, he ascended the ramparts with gray wind, gazing out at a nearly full moon. The courtyard below bustled with men finishing chores, laughter drifting from open windows. A sweet hush lay over the land, broken only by the calls of night birds. He pictured the crossing at the Twins, that haunting moment of betrayal when music turned to slaughter, and thought how far they had come since. The memory still clenched his gut, but he no longer felt paralyzed by it. The Boltons and the Freys had not managed to break him. The North soared again under the direwolf's banner. He placed a hand on the parapet's cold stone. Gray wind nudged his leg, golden eyes scanning the darkness beyond. In that quiet, Robb murmured a vow. Never again will we be caught unawares. The Red Wedding won't define us forever. We have a future. The direwolf snuffed the air, as though agreeing. Robb stroked his thick fur, feeling the old god's presence in the swirl of wind. He drew a breath. So much had changed, but so much remained to do. They had stabilized the North, ended House Bolton, begun forging ties to the Riverlands. The day would come when Walder Frey's stranglehold shattered. Perhaps they would restore Edmure Tully to Riverrun. Perhaps the realm might unify against the Lannisters if needed. The path was uncertain, but at least it was theirs to choose. He turned from the parapet, heading for the steps. A new day awaited, full of decisions about roads, alliances, farmland, and soldier placements. This was the legacy of House Stark. Not the fleeting glory of one victory, but the steady stewardship of a land that had survived centuries. He, Robb Stark, was no longer just the young wolf, a boy king reeling from betrayal. He was king in the North, tested in blood and tragedy, forging a renewed kingdom from the ashes. For once, the future beckoned with more hope than dread. Over the following months, that hope solidified into reality. White Harbor's trade thrived, enabling communities to rebuild. House Glover and House Serwyn cooperated on farmland expansions. The Umbers reasserted themselves near Last Hearth, subduing any stray marauders. The Dreadfort remained quiet under a small Stark-appointed garrison, haunted but obedient to the new order. Patrols across the North rarely encountered major threats. Moat Cailin stood watch, with Ser Lancel Glover's men rotating out. Now and then, they captured a stray Frey scout who tested the boundary. Those men were either turned away or imprisoned. Messages from Caitlin came sporadically, cribbing how the Riverlands' clandestine alliance gathered momentum. Small acts of defiance took place near Riverrun, burning Frey supply wagons, freeing local lords' sons from captivity. Walder Frey responded with crackdowns, but each harsh measure only fanned the flames of resentment. The seeds of rebellion were sown, and House Mallister quietly nurtured them under Caitlin's guidance. She hinted that if circumstances aligned, they might attempt to free Edmure Tully by autumn. That effort would require some northern support, but not a full invasion. Merely enough pressure at the neck to keep Frey reinforcements pinned. Robb responded that he would be ready. He quietly added more watchers at Moat Cailin, building small fortifications beyond the castle's battered towers. He stored extra supplies there, so if an army needed to gather swiftly, they had resources. The men understood the significance. Another conflict with the Freys loomed, but this time the North would choose its ground. The memory of crossbow bolts in the Twins' Great Hall fueled many men's determination to see Walder Frey undone. Occasionally, rumors reached them that the Lannisters were embroiled in fresh power struggles, or that King Tommen's hold wavered. This did not guarantee safety, but it meant the crown might not swiftly come to Walder Frey's aid. None of it was certain. War in Westeros seldom followed neat logic. But every scrap of news bolstered the notion that House Stark might secure true independence if they outmaneuvered their foes. Seasons turned more swiftly in the warmer south, but in the north, spring came late and summer short. By the time the fields near Winterfell began showing healthy green growth, the year's midpoint approached. People thanked the old gods for a respite from war. The Great Hall saw smaller feasts, celebrating local harvests of onions and turnips, the emergence of game in the forests. Some men even proposed a tourney to mark the new peace, though Robb demurred that they had no resources to host such extravagance. Perhaps in future years. He spent many hours each day walking the castle grounds, ensuring that every repair progressed. Now the library tower had partial scaffolding to fix a leaning wall. The smithy, once run by Micken, was manned by an apprentice who hammered out nails and arrowheads. The outer bailey had a new fence for corralled goats. A small group of orphans from the battles scurried around the yard, delivering messages. Sometimes, seeing them laugh reminded him that not all was loss. Life endured. One late afternoon, as he stood in the orchard, admiring the pale blossoms on the apple trees, a watchman's horn sounded from the gate. Another party approached. Heart-quickening, Robb returned to the courtyard. He found Wylus Manderly there, greeting a small group of riders from the south. At their head rode a woman cloaked in gray, who dismounted slowly, drawing back her hood. Robb's relief flared into a grin. It was Caitlin, dusted by the road, looking weary but alive. Her retinue trailed behind, including Ser Marlon Manderly and a few Riverlanders. She turned, spotted Robb, and rushed forward. He strode to meet her, clasping her in a fierce embrace. Gray wind barked, bounding around them. For a moment, all the burdens melted away. She pulled back, studying his face. "I've missed you, and the children," she faltered, remembering those no longer here or uncertain in fate. Then she set her jaw. "I have so much to tell you." He guided her inside. The men dismounted, stable hands leading horses away. Servants bustled to prepare refreshments. Soon, mother and son convened in a private solar, along with Wylus Manderly, Jory Karstark, and a few others. She removed her cloak and sat, breath unsteady, cheeks still flushed from the journey. "My mission was eventful," she began. "Lord Mallister is committed. So are the Blackwoods, at least quietly. The Darys and some minor houses follow suit. They despise the Freys' cruelty. The trouble is coordination. Each house fears a Lannister response. But we have a window. If we can strike quickly to free Edmure, we might spark a larger uprising that dethrones the Freys from Riverrun." She sipped from a cup of watered wine, continuing, "Walder Frey, however, is not idle. He has men fortifying the Twins. They expect an assault sooner or later. They've also pressured local lords to send hostages. Riverrun remains locked down by a Frey garrison. Edmure is alive, captured, but not tortured. They keep him as a bargaining chip. Lord Mallister believes we can slip a small force near Riverrun from the west, while the north threatens from the neck. A two-pronged approach. If the Freys scramble to defend both north and west, they'll weaken their hold on Riverrun. Then an infiltration might rescue Edmure, re-establish Tully rule. The question is whether you're willing to commit men." Robb listened intently, jaw set. "A small force, not a grand invasion," he repeated, glancing at Wylus and Jory. "We'd move men to Moat Cailin, appear ready to strike the Twins if they march out. Force Walder's eye on us. Meanwhile, the Riverlanders move in from the west. Freed from worrying about a northern invasion, Walder could shift men to face them, unless we make him believe the real blow is from the neck." A cunning ruse. Caitlin gave a slight nod. "Precisely. The risk. If the Freys call your bluff and move on the neck first, you'll be forced to commit. Or if the Lannisters intervene, all bets are off. But if it works, Edmure goes free, Riverrun is reclaimed, and Walder's power base cracks. Others might rally behind a restored Tully seat." Robb considered the faces around him. Jory Karstark stroked his chin. Wylus Manderly frowned, but then said, "A bold plan, potentially devastating to the Freys if it succeeds. The North can handle a feint at Moat Cailin, maybe a partial mobilization. But we must maintain enough men to guard Winterfell, the Dreadfort, and our other seats. We can't strip ourselves bare." Robb nodded. "Agreed. We won't leave ourselves vulnerable. But a few hundred men at Moat Cailin, plus some staged movement near the White Knife, might spook Walder. I'd like to see Edmure freed, if only for moral justice. House Tully were our allies from the start. They've suffered enough." Caitlin's eyes glimmered with cautious hope. "Lord Mallister suggests late summer or early autumn, once everyone's prepared. He awaits your final word. If you choose to do it, he'll coordinate the infiltration near Riverrun." Robb inhaled. We'll do it. The Freys remain the greatest threat besides the Lannisters. Undermining them helps us. And if the Riverlands stands behind House Tully, we gain a powerful neighbor that might keep the Lannisters in check. She let out a breath, relief plain. Then I'll write to Lord Mallister. We'll finalize the plan. The next few months will be crucial. We must keep it secret from prying ears. If Walder Frey learns too early, he might kill Edmure or fortify Riverrun beyond measure. Jory Karstark murmured, We'll keep a close watch on travelers in the Neck, possibly intercept more Frey spies. We don't want them gleaning our movements. They closed the meeting with a sense of unified purpose, though the tension was palpable. Another gamble in a realm rife with betrayals. But with the Boltons gone, the North had found a renewed backbone, and the scattered Riverlords yearned to cast off Walder Frey's shadow. If fortune favored them, they might just reshape the political landscape. Over the next weeks, Catelyn rested from her journey, recounting more details of her time in Seaguard. She described meeting the Blackwoods and their ancient godswood, the hush that fell when they spoke of avenging the Red Wedding. She also confided that rumors placed Brynden Blackfish Tully in hiding near the Trident, though unconfirmed. If the Blackfish could be found, he might prove a valuable ally in retaking Riverrun. Robb listened with eager interest. Brynden Tully had been a formidable commander, loyal to House Tully above all. As summer days lengthened, the North bustled. Harvests began in certain southern regions, albeit modest. White Harbor thrived, shipping salted fish far and wide. Winterfell's orchard bore fruit for the first time since the war, not enough to feed an army, but a symbol of revival. Messages from Manderley outposts near the coast reported no major Ironborn threats, though small raids lingered. The Dreadfort garrison had encountered no trouble. House Bolton's name was spoken only in hushed curses. Moat Cailin gradually became a hub of troop movement. Robb dispatched men in small groups so as not to alarm the realm prematurely, but as they gathered, the fortress bristled with arms. If the Freys took the bait, they might assume a larger northern army formed behind it, hidden in the swamps. The truth was they had only a few hundred well-trained soldiers. Enough to threaten if the Freys marched, but not enough to hold the entire region if a massive force attacked. It was all a dance of illusions, reminiscent of the cunning once credited to Roose Bolton, ironically turned against Walder Frey. In early autumn, faint signs came that the Freys were indeed anxious. A captured scout admitted the twins were reinforcing their walls, calling more men from minor vassals. Walder Frey's brood squabbled among themselves about how to handle the Stark threat. Some favored a direct assault on the Neck, others counseled waiting for Lannister support. The old man himself seemed uncertain. This suited Robb's aims perfectly. Then, at last, a coated raven arrived from Seaguard. House Mallister had begun the infiltration near Riverrun. If all went well, in a fortnight's time, they would attempt to free Edmure Tully. Robb was to feign or threaten an advance from the Neck around the same period, drawing any Frey reserves away. The date was set. Catelyn reread the message, adrenaline coursing through her. She knew the dangers intimately. If this failed, Edmure might die, and the Freys would clamp down with renewed brutality. If it succeeded, the tides would turn. Robb assembled his war council. Catelyn, Wylis Manderley, Jory Karstark, Hother Umber, who had arrived for the harvest celebrations. They hammered out the final moves. At a chosen time, Moat Cailin's forces would march south a short distance, staging themselves in a show of force near the causeway. They might even set up a siege camp, as if planning a push on the twins. Scouts would fan out, letting themselves be spotted by Frey watchers. Meanwhile, Catelyn would remain in Winterfell, monitoring any changes. If the Freys advanced, Robb could muster additional men from the region. All was in readiness. The plan hinged on secrecy and timing. The day before the planned feint, Robb departed Winterfell for Moat Cailin, accompanied by a smaller personal guard, Grey Wind at his side. The North had seen him ride forth before. Some men recalled his earlier campaigns. But this time they marched with measured confidence. The memory of betrayal still glowed in each soldier's mind, forging a steeled determination not to be outfoxed again. Moat Cailin, that ancient ruin on the southwestern edge of the neck, greeted them with toppled towers and mossy stones. But the garrison had improved the defenses, raising wooden palisades, clearing swamp brush. Tents spread out behind partial walls. A watchtower soared precariously, manned by archers. When Robb arrived, horns sounded. The men cheered, eager to greet the king in the north. He dismounted, greeting the local commander, Sir Lancel Glover, who offered an update. No major Frey movement, just occasional scouts. They remained ready. Robb spent the next day reviewing the troops. They had around 300 men, mostly archers and light infantry, with a few mounted outriders. Enough to appear threatening, though not a grand host. He planned to lead them forward along the causeway, stopping short of the open fields near the twins. Frey watchers would see the dust of their march, perhaps assume a bigger force behind them. If the Freys hesitated or shifted men from Riverrun to reinforce the twins, that would allow the Mallister infiltration to strike. At dawn on the chosen day, they began. The men formed a loose column, carrying Stark banners in plain sight. They advanced at a steady pace, beating drums. Scouts rode ahead, ensuring no hidden Frey ambush lurked. The land was bleak, patches of swamp on either side. Overhead, a mild sky promised a day of clear weather. Everyone was tense, scanning for enemy signals. No major confrontation was expected, but caution reigned. Robb led from near the front, gray wind loping beside his horse. He felt the old tingle of battle readiness, hoping the ruse wouldn't devolve into a pitched fight. They marched until the causeway opened onto firmer ground, perhaps 15 miles from the twins, well within range for watchers to observe them with spyglasses. There, they set up a temporary camp, raising banners, constructing small siege works. The plan was to linger for a few days, making a show of readiness. Already, outriders reported a flurry of Frey movement beyond the horizon. Walder's men likely debated whether to sally out or call for more troops from Riverrun or the nearby holdfasts. Perfect. Robb busied himself with watch rotations, ensuring no infiltration took them by surprise. By nightfall, they had a ring of torches around the camp, wards and sharpened stakes for defense. Drums pounded occasionally to unnerve the Freys. Each day, a small patrol rode forth, as if surveying approach lines. They fought no major battles, exchanging only distant arrow fire with a few Frey scouts. The tension soared. On the third night, as the men dozed in the ring of tents, an unexpected messenger arrived. A breathless Karstark scout, racing into camp with news. He carried a folded parchment bearing the Mallister sigil. Robb, roused from fitful sleep, took it by torchlight. The scout had rushed from a forward vantage point to deliver it. Inside was a cryptic line. "The fish is in the net. We move tomorrow. Keep the wolves howling." Robb's heart pounded. The infiltration near Riverrun was happening. They planned to rescue Edmure Tully within a day, counting on the Freys to be distracted by Robb's presence at the neck. This was the pivot point. If the rescue succeeded, Edmure would be whisked away to a safe haven, presumably Seaguard or some allied holdfast. If it failed, the Freys might retaliate viciously. Either way, Robb had to maintain the facade for another day or two. He read the line aloud to his key captains, Sir Lancel Glover, a Karstark lieutenant, and a Manderley knight. All nodded gravely. They would keep the posture strong. If the Freys tried a sudden assault, they would fight back. If not, they'd hold position until more news arrived. The next day dawned with thick fog hugging the causeway. The men performed daily drills, scouring the horizon for any sign of a Frey host. None appeared. Robb's watchers glimpsed riders near the twins, but no large movement. Possibly Walder Frey hesitated, uncertain whether to commit. Perfect. By nightfall, still no attack. The men's nerves felt strung tight. Some half expected a massive force to emerge from the mists, but the moors remained eerily silent. Finally, late on that second night, a cloaked figure approached the camp, recognized by the watchers as a Mallister outrider. Robb and Lancel Glover rushed to meet him at the perimeter. The man, panting from a breakneck ride, delivered a small sealed note. By the light of a lantern, Robb read it quickly, heart hammering. The note contained only a few words, but they struck like thunder. "We have Edmure." Freys confused. "Return north safely." Tully claims his seat. He stared at the text, hardly daring to believe. Then a grin split his face, relief washing over him. If the note was truthful, it meant the rescue had succeeded. Edmure Tully was free, the Freys had been duped, and likely Riverrun's seat was now contested if the infiltration forces pressed their advantage. No mention was made of Walder's reaction yet, but if Edmure was truly out of Frey hands, that alone was a momentous shift. He thanked the Mallister outrider, who explained that more details would follow. For now, they simply had to fade back, letting the Freys reel from the blow. Robb conferred with his captains. They agreed to maintain the facade until dawn, then withdraw gradually to Moat Cailin, leaving behind some illusions of a potential return. That would keep Walder on the defensive for a bit longer. At first light, they struck camp with deliberate slowness, letting watchers see the movement as if a retreat or repositioning. By midday, they vanished into the swamps, returning to Moat Cailin in scattered units to avoid ambush. In the evening gloom, horns signaled their arrival at the fortress. Robb was both exhausted and elated. If Edmure was indeed safe, the alliance with the Riverlands might flourish. The blow to Walder Frey's prestige was incalculable. His prized captive snatched from beneath his nose. He paused in the courtyard, gazing at the battered towers of Moat Cailin. Grey wind licked at his gauntlet. "If only father could see it," he murmured. "We did it." He remembered the Red Wedding, how close House Stark had come to annihilation, and marveled at how far they'd turned the tide. Freed from the Boltons, forging alliances, striking at the Freys in cunning ways. The young boy who had declared himself king in the north with naive hope had become a man shaped by sorrow and tempered by vengeance. Yet he lived, and so did his house. They lingered at Moat Cailin for another day to confirm no Frey retaliation was imminent. Then Robb led the men back north. Word spread in hushed murmurs that the Tully rescue had succeeded. Men smiled behind their beards, satisfied at outfoxing the Red Wedding's orchestrators. Freed of immediate danger, they resumed the trek to Winterfell, trudging across muddy roads that had once been locked in ice. Upon arriving at Winterfell, horns sounded, and the gates opened in triumph. Inside, Catelyn awaited, anxious for details. Robb practically swept her into an embrace, breathless in excitement. "Edmure is free," he told her. "The Mallisters wrote it plainly. We haven't the full story, but they said the infiltration succeeded." She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling. "My brother, he's safe at last." Over the next week, ravens arrived clarifying the victory. Edmure Tully had been whisked away from a lightly guarded section of Riverrun's walls by a small team led by Ser Aemon Mallister and a loyal group of Tully men who still lingered in the region. The Freys had discovered the ruse too late. Edmure was hidden in a safe location, rumored to be Seaguard. Riverrun remained contested, but the moral blow to Walder Frey was severe. Many Riverlords now openly rebelled, refusing Frey taxes or refusing to acknowledge Walder's authority. The situation might erupt into a Riverlands civil war, but for the moment, Edmure Tully was free to rally support, possibly regaining his father's seat. At Winterfell, the news sparked quiet celebration. Hother Umber raised a toast in the Great Hall. Wireless Manderley boomed that House Frey would pay double for the Red Wedding. Men spoke of possibly aiding the Riverlands further if needed. Catelyn wept in relief, hugging Robb, whispering thanks to the old gods. She had begun to believe she might never see her brother freed from that hateful captivity. Of course, the fight was not over. Walder Frey would not take this humiliation lightly. He might lash out in the Riverlands or along the neck, or he might beg the Lannisters for help. But for now, the North's cunning had dealt the Freys a grievous wound without major losses. That alone marked a turning point, forging a sense of northern pride. They had come a long way from the Red Wedding's ashes. Robb, standing by a flickering hearth in the Great Hall, reflected on how the North had changed. The old illusions of unstoppable armies were gone. The illusions that loyalty alone kept men safe had died at the twins. They had learned harsh lessons about subterfuge, about forging alliances beyond the normal feudal pacts. They had discovered that sometimes a small, well-timed blow could accomplish what 1,000 swords in open war could not. The future was still uncertain, but they were no longer pawns waiting to be slaughtered. The dire wolf had teeth bared, ready to defend its land. Outside, the northern night draped Winterfell in soft starlight. The orchard's boughs rustled with a warm summer breeze, the first truly gentle wind in years. Gray wind prowled under the trees, sniffing the air. Catelyn joined Robb on a half-repaired balcony, gazing at the stars. She laid a hand on his arm. "I think your father would be proud," she said softly. "You have led the North through unimaginable trials, but we stand strong." He closed his eyes, letting the swirl of gratitude and sorrow fill him. "I hope so," he murmured. "We're not done, and I suspect storms yet to come. But yes, we've reclaimed our homeland, ended the Boltons, and dealt a blow to the Freys. We have a future." She leaned her head on his shoulder, tears of both grief and joy shining in her eyes. "A future they tried to steal from us. But the North remembers, always." He nodded, recalling that old phrase. The North remembers. The phrase had carried them through betrayal and bloodshed. Now it stood as a testament that even in darkness, House Stark endured. The memory of those lost guided them forward. Ned's unwavering honor, the Wolf's loyal bannermen who had perished at the Twins, the fallen at the Dreadfort. They had not died in vain. Robb turned, pressing a soft kiss to his mother's temple. Together, they gazed across Winterfell's courtyard where torches glowed. Men shared quiet camaraderie, stable hands groomed horses. A blacksmith hammered a piece of metal in a distant ring of sparks. Life thrummed. The tragedies of the Red Wedding no longer controlled their destiny. That darkness would always be part of their story, but it was not the end. High above, the moon cast silver on the partial roofs. The faint music of a flute drifted from the great hall, where some men lingered in subdued celebration. Robb inhaled the night air, feeling a sense of peace deeper than he'd known in years. He had once thought vengeance was the sole path forward. Yet as he rebuilt Winterfell, aided the small folk, and established alliances, he realized that honor and unity were equally essential. They had avenged the betrayal in blood, yes, but they had done more, forging a realm that might someday be strong enough to deter future treacheries. Gray wind emerged from the orchard's shadows, trotting up the steps. Catelyn knelt to scratch his ears, murmuring endearments. Robb placed a hand on the wolf's flank. He felt the rumble of breath, the living symbol of House Stark's resilience. A breeze stirred the hair around his face, carrying the scent of pine and newly turned earth. Summer nights in the north were fleeting, but so precious. "We have done it," he whispered. "Though battles still loom, for tonight we can rest." Catelyn nodded, drawing him into one last embrace. "Yes, rest. And tomorrow, we keep building the realm your father envisioned, free of tyranny." They parted, heading inside. The corridor felt warm, lit by guttering torches. Robb lingered in the threshold, casting a final glance over his shoulder. The orchard below shimmered softly. In that moment, he felt he could almost sense Ned Stark's presence, intangible yet comforting, as if the old gods themselves witnessed the dawn of a new era. Night settled, and Winterfell lay quiet, heartbeat steady after so many storms. Far from here, Walder Frey might seethe, the Lannisters might plot, the Ironborn might scheme on their coasts. But within these walls, the king who had escaped death at the Red Wedding and broken the Boltons now guided his people with a tempered hand. House Stark's banner rippled on the ramparts, the dire wolf a silhouette against the moonlit sky. The North remembered, and so would the world. And thus, Robb Stark and his realm drifted into a fragile peace, determined to shape a destiny beyond betrayal's shadow.